Hello everyone. I am your dark narrator here to guide you today. I know many of you use this video to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also drop a comment letting us know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now settle in, get comfortable and relax. When my sister Shelby disappeared, even when they declared her dead, I knew she was still alive. I could feel it, and I was right. Sort of. And so, here I am sitting in my car at 2:10 a.m. near a darkened bus stop that probably hasn't seen another visitor in decades, waiting for her despite being warned of the consequences. I'm writing to distract myself from the nearly overwhelming, increasingly strong prey instinct to run. The urge put as much distance as possible between myself and what I can only describe as the receding nothingness beyond the tree line. 28 days ago, Shelby was driving through Heighten, a tiny town Hello everyone. I am your dark narrator here to guide you today. I know many of you use this video to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also drop a comment letting us know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now settle in, get comfortable and relax. When my sister Shelby disappeared, even when they declared her dead, I knew she was still alive. I could feel it, and I was right. Sort of. And so, here I am sitting in my car at 2:10 a.m. near a darkened bus stop that probably hasn't seen another visitor in decades, waiting for her despite being warned of the consequences. I'm writing to distract myself from the nearly overwhelming, increasingly strong prey instinct to run. The urge put as much distance as possible between myself and what I can only describe as the receding nothingness beyond the tree line. 28 days ago, Shelby was driving through Heighten, a tiny town I'd never heard of until I got the call from the police, until it became the last place my sister was seen before seemingly falling off the face of the earth. I'm still not sure why Shelby was there in the first place. It was far out of the way from Billings where she'd been headed, but I suppose that'll be one more thing I'll never get the answer to. Not from her, at least. They declared her dead. When the Heighten police called me, they told me they found her car, that bright red 15 Mini Cooper she loved so much, wrapped around a tree on the side of the road. If she'd been in the car when they found it, maybe I'd have been more inclined to agree with them. The car was mostly totaled, but what did remain of the interior was immaculate. There was no blood. Her purse and suitcase were there, keys still in the ignition. It was still locked from the inside. Everything was still in the car, everything except for my sister, but the local authorities told me she was dead, and despite my pleas for them to look for her, they straight up refused. No need, they said. So, I knew it was on me to find her. I was running late on my first visit to Heighten. A delayed flight and mix-up with my rental car when I finally landed meant I wasn't approaching the town until it was nearly 12 a.m. To top off an already bad situation, I was lost. My GPS told me to take exit 19C, but I couldn't find it. I'd taken several U-turns and looped back a few times, and each time grew more and more frustrated as I'd see 19A, 19B, and then exit 20. It's not like 19C was recently closed either. The guardrails were perfect, seamless, and beyond the highway was nothing but trees and craggy rock. No, it was more like there wasn't an exit 19C. There never had been. And to further exacerbate my building anxiety, my GPS refused to provide me with an alternate route. As far as Google Maps was concerned, the only way into Heighten was to take an exit that didn't exist. After 3 more loops around the highway, I finally gave up and stopped at a crappy motel conveniently located off exit 19B. I asked the guy at the desk if he could suggest a way to get to town, since at that point, I had no clue how I was supposed to find Heighten. He looked tired, and not merely 1 a.m. tired. No, he looked exhausted by life tired, and didn't even bother glancing up from the book he was reading when he dismissively told me, "It'll be back in the morning." "The exit?" I asked, sarcasm a thin veneer as I tried masking my racked nerves and that I was on the verge of tears. "Or the town?" He just shrugged non-committally. I lost it in that moment. Head in hands, I broke down sobbing on the dingy check-in desk of that seedy motel. He was kind enough to ask if I was okay, and I instantly found myself telling him everything. Why I was headed there, how unhelpful the authorities were, how I knew the only way I'd find her is if I went searching for her myself. After a brief silence, he quietly confided that he'd also lost someone. His fiancée had gone to Myerton several years ago, and she too had disappeared. Did they ever find her? I asked it automatically, even though I was fairly sure I already knew the answer based on the decades' worth of misery etched into his face. So it took me by surprise when he nodded. He stared off into space for the longest time before he whispered, "I wish they hadn't." He introduced himself as Gary, and told me that my sister Shelby was gone, that nothing good could possibly come from me going to look for her. When he couldn't talk me into turning around and going back home, he offered me a room for the night. As he handed me the key, he reluctantly told me that 19C would be back at 2 a.m., but would be gone by 11 p.m. the next night. I knew he was messing with me, that no road would magically appear. I figured I'd try to get some sleep and then drive to the next town over to see if someone else would help me. So you can imagine my utter shock the next morning when, sure enough, just like Gary had assured me, where before there had been a solid metal guardrail, there was an exit. I'd found 19C. The worn gravel and peeling paint of the off-ramp seemed to indicate a well-traveled road, too. So I followed the winding one-lane road through the trees, and I was confused yet relieved when I found my way to Myerton. That relief was short-lived. The police were somehow even more unhelpful in person, insisting Shelby was gone, and I should go home, move on. It didn't matter that she'd only been missing a couple of days. It didn't matter that there wasn't a body. I wasted hours at the station, changing nothing, convincing no one. The case was closed, they told me. As far as they were concerned, my sister was dead. Now, based on what I've learned, I almost wish she was. That would have been more merciful. A kindness, even. As I continued my own search for her, the longer I lingered, the more I realized that something was very, very wrong with the town of Myerton. Every single house that wasn't already demolished sat abandoned, the structures slowly being reclaimed by overgrown lawns and encroaching woods. The sidewalks were empty of people, and I only saw 2 other cars on the road in all the hours I was there. The few businesses that remained open had only a handful of customers inside, and they were clearly not happy to see me there. Every single person I asked told me the same thing. It was eerie how their responses were so similar, almost word for word as if rehearsed. That they'd never seen my sister before, that there was nothing for me in their town and I needed to leave. And then, with what seemed like a genuine sadness, they were sorry for my loss. Eventually, 10:50 p.m. rolled around and I'd still found nothing. The stores all closed at 10 p.m., even those traditionally open for 24 hours elsewhere, were closed 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. I'd watched the town shut down, watched it empty of people. So frustrated, I pulled into one of the many empty parking lots, and I stared at the shadowy expanse of trees where her car had been found. The air was stale and heavy with an unnerving silence thick enough to choke on. It was in that moment, as I sat in the red glow of the shut-down pumps of the only open for 19 hours gas station I'd ever seen in my life, that I first picked up the hint of wrongness in the air. I could suddenly feel that there was something out there beyond my line of sight, something waiting just past the trees, something terrible. I realized that Gary and the handful of people I'd encountered were right. I needed to leave. I had that epiphany a little too late, because what began to happen next was the cherry on top of my shit Sunday of a day. As I took a final look into the trees as if they could give me a sign, an answer, a darkness unlike anything else I'd ever witnessed began to seep through them, swallowing them. It choked out the light from the moon. It was like a curtain of nothingness, a presence only detectable by the absence of everything it touched. It carried with it a smell of burning meat mingled with rotting fruit that suddenly flooded through my open windows. I found myself frozen as it approached. As it swallowed the houses down the street, I could feel a strong sense of emptiness, one that sucked the air out of my lungs, threatening to crush me. At the same time, it felt right. An extended invitation towards the embrace of nothingness, towards something ancient and insatiable. The encroaching darkness swallowed the crimson glow from the gas station pumps. It was only the realization that the blackness had begun to nullify the light of my headlights that snapped me out of it. I three-point turned my way the hell out of there, peeling out and pushing 65 down the winding road out of town. In that moment, I was thankful the town was empty of police, too, approaching the on-ramp at 10:59. I didn't understand what was happening at first. Why the road I was driving along looked faded. That's when I saw something metal shimmering faintly in the distance. It didn't look solid, as if it wasn't entirely there, so it took me a moment to realize what it was. A guardrail. I tried to swerve and slam on the brakes before I hit it, but I was going almost 90 by that point, and the laws of physics and I had differing opinions on what the correct stopping distance would be. I braced for an ending that I wondered if my body would even feel, brain even register. But none came. No, instead of the sound of metal on metal, my ears were met with the angry honking of the person I'd cut off, as I messily swerved onto I-15. I was back on the highway, the light of Gary's seedy little motel visible from across the way. I took one last glance at the place where exit 19C had once been, and once again ceased to be. I didn't know what else to do, so I went back to the motel, breathless, describing every moment of my ordeal to Gary. He didn't look even remotely fazed by my story, instead opting to stare into space. I realized then that the police were right. She really was gone. She'll be back, well, part of her will, he finally told me, perhaps in response to the look of hopelessness that must have been written on my face. 2:30 a.m., 28 days after she first disappeared at the bus stop off Main Street. Are you sure? That's where they always come back. He smiled sadly before engrossing himself back in his book. That was weeks ago. As of this morning, it's been 28 days since Shelby first disappeared. I touched down in Billings and made the 6-hour drive to the outskirts of Meyerton, waiting patiently for the exit to appear. I debated stopping by to see Gary, but decided against it. He'd asked me not to tell him if I chose to go back. He said he didn't want whatever happened to me on his conscience. But it's 2:29 a.m. now, and here I am anyway, sitting at the ancient bus stop in the empty city of Meyerton, a city that has only recently returned to existence, staring into the last of the receding darkness. I can see Shelby in the distance now, pale in the faint moonlight, barefoot, immaculate for someone missing for a month and emerging from the woods. I found her. Even from here I can feel something radiating from her, an emptiness, a yearning hollowness, a hunger for something far more precious than mere flesh and bone. I should be running to embrace her. I should be ecstatic. Instead, I'm frozen, overtaken by another emotion entirely, one I've never felt before around my sister. Fear. No, not just fear. An overwhelming, suffocating terror. It's not just that now familiar emptiness that radiates from her the same way it did from the beckoning nothingness when it nearly claimed me last month. It's not even the way her skin seems too tight on her frame, or that she's taller than I remember. No, it's that awful predatory smile on my sister's face, one I have not seen in all of our 26 years together. She moves as gracefully as she did in life, but in her eyes I see only death. I realize, as I watch the palpable nothingness incarnate that is wrapped in my sister's flesh, that I'm not sure what exactly she wants, what it is that she hungers for. In a way, I wish she hadn't come back. I should have believed those that told me she was gone. Because she is. She is utterly devoid of everything that had made her my sister. As I fight the urge to run to the car, to leave Meyerton before whatever it is that wears my sister's skin like a too-tight suit can reach me, I can't help but replay my final conversation with Gary in my head. So, I'd confirmed, she'll be back in exactly 28 days from when she went missing. He'd nodded, no longer able to meet my eyes. But I need to warn you, Sheila, if you thought it was bad when she disappeared. He paused to stare past me and into the dark expanse of trees off the highway. It'll be 1,000 times worse when she comes back. I told him I knew I was doing the right thing, that trying to save my sister could never be a mistake. Oh God, she's closer now. I cannot tell if she seeks to fill that void by dragging me back with her, or if the hunger is more primal, more literal. All I know is that the Shelby that disappeared, that I lost, is not the same Shelby that I see before me now. I'm frozen to the spot now as if I'm trapped by her gaze. I'm going to share this while I still can. Maybe I made a mistake after all. When I got home from my every other Tuesday Spanish club meeting, there was a girl sitting on our front stoop. She looked 9 or 10, with bangs that looked like they'd been scissored at home and jeans with iron-on patches on the knees. "Hey," I said, "are you Charlie's friend?" She glanced up at me with a transient flicker of curiosity, then looked back down. She was using a stick to score faint white lines into the lower step. I made out the letters ADE before she rubbed it away with a foot. "He's at soccer practice," I said, "but you can come in and wait. I can get you a snack." She kept drawing with the stick as if I hadn't spoken, an animal with round ears like a panda or monkey. I waited there a little longer, then shrugged and went in. Charlie got home half an hour later, his blonde hair dark with sweat, flinging his bag by the entranceway. I looked behind him for the girl, but he was alone when he came into the kitchen. "The girl outside," I said. "Do you know her? You should tell her to come in." Charlie looked annoyed. "Stop fucking with me. You're not going to make me look." "Don't say fuck," I said automatically. "And I'm not—" "Oh, never mind." He opened the pantry. I stepped into the living room and took another look out the window. The girl was still there, the back of her fair head visible past the curtain. Either my little brother was playing some sort of elaborate reverse prank on me, or he really couldn't see her. She was there the next day, too, and every day after that, wearing a powder blue jacket with matted fake fur in the winter, a tank top and stringy cutoffs in the summer. Once she was reading a book. I tried to look at the title, but I couldn't make it out. Nobody else ever saw her. Eventually, I just started walking past her, like she was a Halloween display or one of those ornamental dogwood shrubs my mom liked to buy. One day before band practice, I asked my friend Kate if she believed in ghosts. "You mean like Casper or like some Bloody Mary mindfuckery?" "I don't know, maybe." "Why?" "I think there might be something in my house," I said. "Not a rattling plates and scribbling threats and mirrors kind of ghost. Just like a presence." "Maybe someone died in your house," she said. "Or maybe a serial killer used to live there and there's a body buried in your backyard and it's crying out for you to get justice. Maybe it's the specter of your Ivy League dreams after you bombed the last calc test. If that's how it works, you should consider charging admission to your place next October." She cackled. Later, I set my clarinet down on the steps and crouched beneath the girl, so I was looking up into her face. "I can help you if you need it," I said. "What's your name? Do you need help? Do you want us to do something for you?" She lifted her head, her gaze moving in a way that could have meant she was looking at me or at the neighbor's car across the way. She was shredding a leaf, arranging the pieces into a careful mosaic. A little stick figure, a girl in a triangular skirt, pointillized flowers and clouds around her. That night, I looked up our address and found the names of the owners before us. Stephen and Jeanette Finneran. I opened another tab and Googled their names. A full page of news articles came up. The dad had caught the mom trying to leave with the kids, so he packed them all into the car, drove them to a motel, shot his wife and kids, and then turned the gun on himself. There was one survivor, the article said, a minor, who'd been at a friend's house at the time. The article listed the siblings' names: Alexander, age 12, Annalise, age 10, Augustin, age 4. I looked up Adelaide Finneran, then Adeline Finneran and Adele Finneran. Adelia Finneran popped. An obituary. She'd been in a car accident with her foster parents just a year after her family was killed. In the photo, she was smiling, a stuffed monkey pressed to her cheek. She had the same uneven bangs, a missing canine tooth, a shirt with hearts on it, but her eyes looked older. The next day, when I got back from school, I knelt beside the girl on the stoop. "Hey," I said. "Your name is Adelia, right? You're waiting for your family, aren't you?" She looked up at me, and this time she didn't look back down. They're not coming back here," I said. "I'm sorry. I think it might be better for you to go somewhere else. Somewhere beyond all this. Somewhere you can see them again." She blinked up at me. Birds chirped from hidden perches and a slight wind stirred the green leaves. "Can you show me where?" she asked. Her voice was deeper than I expected, the low, raspy kind of kid voice. "Okay," I said. I thought about driving her to the cemetery where her mother and siblings were buried if I could search up where it was. It could get her to understand that they were gone, let her find peace or at least oblivion. She reached up a hand and I took it. Her hand was small and cold in mine, and I was reminded of holding Charlie's hand, when he would still tolerate it, helping him toddle beside me and ferrying him across crosswalks. I helped her up and led her down the first step, her hand still wrapped around mine. As I stepped off the second step, her grip tightened. My head felt staticky from standing up. Her skin was freezing and there was a feeling of building emptiness, like something more essential than blood flooding out of me. My thoughts dissolved when I tried to grasp them. There was something I was planning to do, something I'd been about to do. There was no one around. My backpack dangled from my arm. The door was locked, but I couldn't remember where the spare key might have been. I sat down on the stoop to wait. A few times a day, some people pass by. A man and a woman and a blonde boy. His name is Charlie. He has a sister, doesn't he? Yes, a younger sister, of course. She has fair hair like him and likes to cut her own bangs. In winter, they go sledding, and in summer, they kick a soccer ball around the yard. It never feels hot or cold on the step. I don't know how long I've been sitting here. Children play on the street, and there's a song a woman is singing that I feel like I should remember. There are things I need to do, but I'm waiting for my family. They'll be home soon. I've been a cleaner at the association for 6 years now, and in that time I've seen my fair share of strange and horrifying things. I still can't decide what's worse, the half-decayed corpses of creatures that shouldn't exist, or the wardens walking around freely, who can transform into absolute monsters in the blink of an eye. But the strangest, most unsettling experience of my life didn't involve blood or gore. It involved a series of conversations I'll never forget. It happened during my routine rounds on the containment floor. For those unfamiliar, the containment floor is where the association keeps aberrations that can't be destroyed, or at least not easily. Some are there because they're too valuable to eliminate, others because killing them would have consequences we're not prepared to deal with. Cell 113 belonged to the latter category. We don't know what the thing in Cell 113 is, not exactly. It's humanoid, but only vaguely. It sits at the center of its cell, shrouded in shadows that shouldn't exist, and it never moves. Its containment protocols are strict. No direct contact, no more than 3 cleaners in the vicinity at once. And under no circumstances are we allowed to stand in front of its viewing window for more than 30 seconds. The official reason is, prolonged exposure may lead to psychological contamination. Most cleaners avoid Cell 113 altogether. I didn't have that luxury. My job that day was to sanitize the hallway directly in front of its cell, which had been flagged for maintenance due to an unexplained dampness seeping from the walls. I tried to work quickly, scrubbing at the dark stains on the floor and muttering to myself to break the silence. That was my first mistake. "You're quite the chatterbox, aren't you?" The voice stopped me cold. It was deep and resonant, like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned my head toward the cell, my heart pounding. The thing in Cell 113 had never spoken before, as far as I knew. The viewing window was dark, and I couldn't see anything beyond the faint outline of its hunched form. "I'm not supposed to talk to you," I said, breaking rule number 1 of containment. "Don't engage." "Ah, but you already are," it replied, a hint of amusement in its tone. "Tell me, do they ever tell you why you're not supposed to linger here?" I didn't answer. Instead, I focused on my work, scrubbing harder at a particularly stubborn stain. My hands were trembling, though, and I'm sure it noticed. "They're afraid of what you might hear," it continued. "Of what I might tell you. They think ignorance will protect you." "It's not my job to know anything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, but ignorance is such a fragile thing, isn't it? So easily shattered." I should have walked away then. I should have dropped my mop and left the hallway without looking back. But something about its voice, smooth and almost hypnotic, rooted me in place. Against my better judgment, I glanced toward the viewing window. The darkness inside seemed to shift, like the shadows were alive. And then I saw them. 2 pinpricks of light, faint and golden like distant stars. Eyes. They were looking directly at me. "You have questions," it said, its tone softening. "I can feel them pressing against your mind. Ask." I shook my head. "I don't have questions. I just want to finish my job." "Liar," it said, and for a moment its voice was sharp enough to cut. "You wonder why they keep me here, why they're so afraid of me. You wonder what I am." It was right, of course, but I didn't dare admit it. "Do you know what fear tastes like?" it asked, its voice dropping to a whisper. "Yours is bitter, but not unpleasant. You're afraid of me, yes, but you're more afraid of what your curiosity might cost you. A wise fear, but misplaced." My hands tightened around the mop handle. "I need to finish my work." "Of course you do. But before you go, a gift." I froze, dread pooling in my stomach. "I don't want anything from you." The thing chuckled, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to rattle the walls. "Want has little to do with it. Gifts are obligations, cleaner, and this one is harmless, for now." Against my will, I found myself stepping closer to the cell, the mop still in my trembling hands. I wanted to stop, to turn and run, but my legs felt like they were moving on their own. The golden pinpricks of its eyes bore into me, and for a moment I thought I saw shapes in the shadows, twisting, writhing forms that seemed to press against the glass. "Look at the floor," it murmured, its voice barely audible yet impossible to ignore. I hesitated, then glanced down. There, at the base of the viewing window, was a small puddle of the same dark dampness I'd been cleaning. But this one was different. It wasn't just water. It shimmered faintly, like oil on asphalt under the sun. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "A piece of me," it said. "A token of our conversation. Take it or leave it, but know this. The choice you make will shape the path ahead." "No," I whispered, taking a step back. "I'm not taking anything from you." The thing laughed again, louder this time, the sound echoing down the hallway. Wise, perhaps, but wisdom does not always shield you from consequence. I turned and fled, leaving the mop and bucket behind. The shadows seemed to cling to me as I ran, stretching unnaturally long down the corridor. By the time I reached the elevator, my chest was heaving, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the button to take me back up. When I returned to the maintenance office, the supervisor gave me a funny look. "You didn't finish the job?" he asked, glancing at the bucket in my hands, still full of dirty water. Something came up," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. He frowned but didn't press me. "Fine, but you're on containment duty again tomorrow, same area." My stomach dropped. I wanted to argue, to refuse, but I knew it would only draw more attention. And the last thing I needed was for anyone to know what had happened. Or worse, what I'd heard. That night, sleep refused to come. Every creak of my apartment seemed louder than usual, every shadow longer and darker than it had any right to be. The faint hum of the refrigerator felt oppressive, and I caught myself glancing at corners of the room like something might emerge from them. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the thing in cell 113 wasn't capable of reaching me outside its containment. But the whisper lingered in my mind. The choice you make will shape the path ahead. When my shift started the next day, I avoided the containment floor for as long as I could. I scrubbed bathrooms, took out trash, and even volunteered to clean the cafeteria. Anything to keep me far away from that corridor. But eventually, my supervisor found me, clipboard in hand and a scowl on his face. "Hall 6C, he said. "You left it a mess yesterday, and you're on containment duty, no excuses." I wanted to argue, to tell him to send someone else, but the words died in my throat. I nodded and grabbed my supplies, feeling like I was marching to my own execution. The hallway was exactly as I'd left it, dark, damp, and humming with an unnatural stillness. The stains on the floor had spread slightly, and the air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing against my chest. The corridor was silent, except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights, but I could feel its presence, awake and watching. I tried to work quickly, keeping my head down and my movements efficient. The rules were simple. Don't look into the cell. Don't engage. But then it spoke. "You returned." Its voice stopped me in my tracks, smooth and resonant, echoing like it came from all directions at once. It wasn't the kind of voice you could ignore. It reached into you, demanded attention. I didn't respond, gripping the mop tighter and focusing on scrubbing the floor. "Silent today? That's disappointing," it said with a hint of amusement. "I thought we were making progress." "I'm just here to do my job," I muttered, keeping my eyes fixed on the tile. "Ah, but that's the thing about humans, isn't it?" it said, its tone almost conversational. "You always reduce yourselves to your roles, cleaner, warden, director, as if those labels are enough to hold your fragile minds together." I paused, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm not supposed to talk to you." "And yet here you are," it said, a chuckle rumbling through the air. "Talking, listening, lingering. Tell me, cleaner, do you enjoy this work? Scrubbing away filth, pretending not to see the stains that never truly leave." I hesitated, the mop trembling in my hands. "It's just a job." "Is it?" it asked, its voice dropping to a whisper. "Or is it a distraction? A way to ignore the questions clawing at the edges of your mind? I can feel them, you know. The doubts, the little cracks in the veneer." I forced myself to keep scrubbing, but the words burrowed into me. "They don't tell you much, do they?" it continued. "They let you walk these halls, clean these cells, and expect you not to wonder. Not to question what's locked behind these doors, what's watching you from the dark." "I don't need to know," I said, though the words felt hollow. Its laughter was low and mocking. Humans are such poor liars. Your kind craves understanding even when it destroys you, especially when it destroys you. The shadows in the cell seemed to pulse, shifting and writhing like living things. 2 faint pinpricks of light appeared in the darkness, golden and piercing. Eyes. They held me in place, drawing me closer without me realizing I'd taken a step forward. "You want to know what I am," it said, its tone soft and almost kind. "You want to know why they're so afraid of me? Why they keep me hidden down here in the dark?" "I don't," I whispered, though my voice betrayed me. "Oh, but you do," it said. "And that's the beautiful thing about your kind. Your curiosity is both your greatest strength and your undoing. It's why you've conquered so much, why you've built empires, but it's also why you destroy yourselves, over and over again. You can't help it. You have to look. You have to know." The golden eyes seemed to grow brighter, and I felt an almost magnetic pull, like gravity itself was urging me closer to the cell. I tightened my grip on the mop handle, trying to ground myself. "Tell me, cleaner," it said, its voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you ever wonder what lies behind the mask you wear, the role they've given you? Do you ever wonder who you really are?" "I'm just a cleaner," I said, but the words sounded weak even to me. "Is that what they told you? That you're just a cog in the machine, disposable and insignificant?" Its voice took on a sharper edge. "Or is that what you tell yourself because it's easier than asking the questions that matter?" The air felt colder now, and I could see my breath in front of me. My heart was racing and every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. "Come closer," it said, its voice almost gentle now. "Ask the question you're afraid to ask. Let me show you what they don't want you to see." I shook my head, forcing my legs to move, backing away from the cell. "I'm not supposed to talk to you. I'm not supposed to—" "Leave then," it said, cutting me off. "Run back to your small, safe world, but you'll return, you always do. Humans are nothing if not predictable." I turned and stumbled down the hallway, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But as I walked away, its final words echoed in my mind. "You can't clean away the truth, cleaner. Those stains always remain." For days, I couldn't shake the aberration's words. Its voice echoed in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming, and with each repetition, the meaning became heavier, darker. The thought of it festered, creeping into every part of my life. I started jumping at shadows, second-guessing the wardens I'd once admired, even losing sleep as I turned its cryptic warnings over and over in my head. I thought I could ignore it, that the feeling would pass. But it didn't. It only grew worse, clawing at the edges of my sanity until I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth. Or at least whatever version of the truth that thing was willing to give me. Against every rule, every shred of common sense, I decided to visit cell 113 one last time. The hallway leading to the cell felt darker than usual, the fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead like a warning. My hand trembled as I swiped my keycard and stepped inside the observation chamber. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and the shadows in the cell seemed thicker than before, writhing like living things. "You've come back," the voice greeted me, smooth and amused. The golden pinpricks of light that I assumed were its eyes flared faintly in the dark. "I must admit I didn't expect you to last this long." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. "You've been in my head," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I need answers. I need to know why you're here. Why someone like you, something like you, is locked up." The aberration chuckled, the sound low and almost human, but not quite. "Locked up," it repeated, savoring the words like a fine wine. "No, child, I'm not contained. I am simply waiting. Waiting as I have for centuries." Its words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to stay. "Waiting for what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "For your kind to understand what you truly are," it said. "You humans are an amusing species. So quick to forget, so eager to believe you are the architects of your own fate. But your kind was never alone. When the dark pressed in and the beasts roamed free, you cried out, not to gods, but to things older and far hungrier. And we answered. We gave you what you needed to rise, to fight, to thrive. But nothing is free. Your kind struck a bargain, one you cannot remember but are still bound to. The guardians, the wardens, they are not saviors. They are the remnants of a deal you no longer understand. And when the time comes, when your borrowed strength no longer satisfies the debt, those who gave it to you will return. I felt a lump rise in my throat. What do you mean, return? Are you saying the wardens can't stop what's coming? The wardens? The aberration said, with a low, guttural laugh like the grinding of stone. They are more than imperfect. They are fractured reflections of the pact your kind struck. There is an aberration in them, a monstrous side clawing beneath their skin. That is why they need the guardians. Without the bond, they would lose themselves to what they are, become the very things you fear. The pact binds them, keeps them tethered to what is left of their humanity. But even that is not enough, is it? Do you think they would protect you if they truly understood what they are? Or would they turn against you instead? Its words sank into me like hooks, dragging me down into a spiral of doubt and fear. I thought of the wardens I'd worked with over the years, their quiet confidence, their unmatched strength. They always seemed so sure, so unwavering. But now I couldn't shake the images in my mind, the way their eyes gleamed too sharply in the heat of battle, the feral, almost predatory way they moved as they closed in on their prey. The guardians, always so loyal, sometimes seemed to act with a purpose that didn't belong to their wardens at all. I started to wonder, were they truly protectors, or were they simply beasts held on a fraying leash? What if their strength wasn't a gift, but a curse they barely kept in check? I clenched my fists, my voice rising in frustration. Why are you telling me this? What's your angle? If you're not locked up, if you're just waiting, then why are you still here? The aberration's eyes seemed to burn brighter, and I could feel its grin even though I couldn't see its face. Because I enjoy watching, it said simply. Watching your kind struggle to understand, to piece together the fragments of a truth that would shatter you if you ever grasped it. You're like children playing with fire, so sure of your safety until the flames consume you. My heart was pounding, but I refused to back down. Then who are you? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. What are you? For the first time, the aberration was silent. The golden lights of its eyes dimmed, and for a moment I thought it wouldn't answer. Then it spoke, its voice quieter but somehow more menacing than before. I am what waits beyond the veil of your understanding, the crawling chaos that whispers in the void. Your kind once called us gods, but we are far older than your faiths, far older than your stars. You might call me a great old one, but even that name is a shadow of what I am. I am the hunger beneath your fragile reality, the storm that watches from the abyss. I am not your enemy, child. I am inevitability. I staggered back, the weight of its words pressing down on me like a physical force. My vision blurred, and the air felt too thin, too heavy. I didn't know what to believe anymore, but one thing was certain. I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned and stumbled out of the observation chamber, my heart racing as I made my way back to the upper levels. The aberration's laughter followed me, soft and mocking, like the echo of a nightmare I'd never fully wake from. In the days that followed, its words burrowed deep into my mind, festering like an open wound. I couldn't escape them, couldn't stop replaying every cryptic sentence. I didn't have access to the association's most sensitive records. Cleaners like me weren't meant to question, only to follow orders. But even from the scraps I'd seen in passing, the whispers in the halls and the fragmented stories shared by veterans, I started to piece together something horrifying. Or rather, I started to notice what wasn't there. There were no traces of rituals, no records of the warden's origins, no mention of where their power came from. Just silence, as though it had all been scrubbed away, leaving only questions no one dared to ask. If what the entity in Cell 113 said was true, then humanity isn't fighting to win. We were just stalling, holding back an inevitable tide that had been promised long before any of us were born. I've never been one to indulge in self-care. Life as a young professional in a bustling city left little room for such luxuries. But after months of grueling hours at work, my body ached for relief, and my mind desperately needed a break from the chaos. So when I heard about Elysium Touch, the new massage parlor that had opened just down the street, I was intrigued enough to give it a try. As I stepped inside, the receptionist greeted me with a warm smile, and a delicate aroma of essential oils wafted through the air. Instantly, it felt as if I had entered another world, one where stress simply melted away. Minutes later, I was introduced to my masseuse, Nina. She was strikingly beautiful, tall, with an athletic build that suggested she took great care of herself. Her long, dark hair fell in soft waves down her back, glistening under the parlor's gentle lights, accentuating her high cheekbones and delicate jawline. As she led me to the massage room, her captivating green eyes sparkled with warmth and kindness, instantly putting me at ease. The deep tissue massage I'd chosen unfolded like a carefully choreographed symphony. Every movement of her hands was deliberate, soothing, expertly targeting the knots that had lodged themselves deep in my muscles. The oils she used filled the room, their aroma wrapping around me like a warm embrace, drawing me deeper into relaxation. The rhythmic, melodic music in the background was almost hypnotic. Time seemed to disappear as my worries dissolved, replaced by a serenity I hadn't felt in years. Soon I became a regular at Elysium Touch, visiting at least once a week. Each session felt like a mini escape from reality. I even took advantage of their enticing discount packages, and on my last visit I received nearly 75% off, a deal that made no business sense to me, but who was I to complain? However, when I visited Elysium for the fourth time, I had no idea what awaited me that night. The management called my number, offering a complimentary massage as a reward for my loyalty, saying I only needed to pay for refreshments. In hindsight, that should have set off alarm bells in my head, but all I could think about was Nina. Over the weeks, I had begun to feel an unexpected connection with her. Nina listened, laughed at my terrible jokes, and even shared snippets of her own life. Nina's also the curious sort. She likes to learn more about her clients, and I, for one, am always happy to share. I told her about where I worked, what I did for a living, and that I had no family to speak of and lived alone not far from here. Sometimes I even seriously considered asking her out on a date so that I could get to know her better. But that night something was off, really off. As the massage began, everything felt familiar at first. Her touch, the soothing oils, the gentle music. But this time the oils had a stronger scent, almost overwhelming. A strange fuzziness started to creep over me. I tried to stay awake, to focus, but the effort felt ultimately futile. My grip on consciousness was slipping, and before I knew it, I was being pulled into a deep, inescapable sleep. When I finally woke up, bright white lights hurt my eyes and a coldness seeped into my bones. Panic clawed at my throat as I tried to move. I realized quickly that I was strapped to a cold metal operating table. My heart raced, pounding against my chest like a caged animal. The last thing I remembered was Nina's touch, her smile. Where was she now? And who were all these people? I looked around, my pulse quickening as masked figures surrounded me, their faces obscured by surgical masks. A deep, unsettling chill settled in my gut as I tried to comprehend the situation. "Ah, you're awake," a voice said, smooth and eerily calm. It belonged to a man dressed in scrubs. His eyes gleamed with a sadistic glint. "Welcome to my operating table. My name is Dr. Harrow, and I'll be your surgeon today." My mind raced. What's happening? Let me go!" I screamed. But my voice sounded weak and distant. Dr. Harrow picked up a scalpel, holding it delicately between his fingers, letting it glint menacingly under the bright lights. "This little tool will help us acquire what we need from you, Alex. Thanks to your sacrifice, you'll save a lot of lives and also help us make a lot of money," he said as those gathered around him, also dressed in scrubs, nodded in unison, their eyes fixed on me. "Do you want to know what we're going to take from you, Alex?" he continued, smiling as he slowly traced the blade over my body, lingering over my kidneys, lungs, heart, throat, and finally resting just above my eyes. At that moment, the horrifying realization hit me. I had just fallen victim to an organ trafficking ring. I recoiled in terror, frantically trying to free myself, but my hands and feet were bound tightly to the table. "Now let's get you ready, shall we?" Dr. Harrow spoke, signaling to one of his assistants who approached me with a syringe in his hand. I recognized it was anesthesia. They were going to put me to sleep again. Fear clawed at my insides as I thought of being trapped in this filthy makeshift underground clinic. The reality of what was happening, that my body was about to be sliced apart for its organs, hit me like a sledgehammer. My heart pounded in my chest, the weight of my own impending death pressing down on me. Just as the needle pricked my skin, I heard a loud bang from outside the room. The doors of the operating room suddenly flew open, and a group of police officers stormed in. "Police! Hands in the air!" they shouted, guns drawn. Panic swept through the room. Dr. Harrow reacted quickly, yanking my head back and pressing the scalpel to my throat. "Stay back or I'll slit his throat," he yelled, his voice cracking, his eyes wild. I could barely breathe. The cold edge of the scalpel dug into my neck and every muscle in my body froze. Then, in a flash, a single gunshot rang out. Harrow's body jerked violently, his head snapping back as blood sprayed across my face. He crumpled on top of me, his dead weight pressing me into the table. I screamed, choking on panic as gunfire erupted in all directions between the police and the remaining goons. The operating table jolted, tipping over, and I crashed to the floor. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and before I could process what was happening, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a hospital room, a warm blanket draped over me. Officer Reed sat beside my bed, relief softening the lines on his face. "You're safe now, Alex," he said, his voice steady. "We got there just in time. They were about to operate on you, steal your organs." I blinked, trying to process the whirlwind of events. The massage parlor. Nina. Was she part of this? Reed shook his head. "No, Nina's an undercover agent. We've been investigating Elysium Touch for weeks. They specifically target individuals who live alone and have no close living relatives. It's a massive organ smuggling ring. They research their clients, choosing those who fit their profile. That's how they've stayed under the radar for so long. You were almost their next victim." His words sank in slowly. "So Nina, she saved me?" I asked. "Yes," he confirmed. "Her undercover work brought us to you just in time." The weight of betrayal still settled heavily on my chest, even as I learned the truth about Nina. "I thought she cared. I thought she was different," I said finally. Reed's expression suddenly softened as he let out a deep sigh. "Nina did what she had to in order to maintain her cover. You're lucky to be alive, Alex. These are dangerous people, constantly moving to avoid detection. They've gotten away with it for too long, but this time we'll make sure they face justice." I spent a few more days in the hospital, my body slowly healing, but my mind remained trapped in that cold, sterile operating room. Nightmares plagued my sleep. Visions of Dr. Harrow looming over me, scalpel in hand. Despite the lingering fear, I forced myself to return to some sense of normalcy, pushing through the unease that clung to me now like a second skin. I had been given a second chance, and I wanted to make it count even though it was difficult to find peace in the chaos. Then one evening I saw her, Nina, walking along the sidewalk. For a moment I hesitated, unsure of what to say, but gratitude pushed me forward. "Nina," I called out, my voice a little shaky. She turned, her eyes meeting mine. "Thank you for saving my life," I said. She gave a small nod, her face softening just slightly. After a beat I blurted out, "Would you maybe want to grab coffee sometime?" She paused, considering, then nodded. "Sure," she replied, her voice calm but sincere. A brief, tentative smile passed between us, and for the first time I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of healing. Maybe, despite everything, I could find a way to move forward with a happy ending, no pun intended. Hillcrest Lane is a quiet place. The kind of suburban street where every house looks the same. Big lawns, two-car garages, lights off by 10 p.m. You'd think a place like this would have advanced security cameras or alarms. But that's the thing about people in neighborhoods like this. They don't expect trouble. They assume danger stays far away in these parts of town. Lucky for guys like me, they're wrong. I was standing in the shadows, just outside the side gate of a house that I'd been watching for a couple of weeks. It belonged to a guy in his early 40s, lived alone, and worked a boring 9-to-5 job. Every night he came home, parked his car in the driveway, and disappeared inside until morning. No guests, no family, just him. I waited just to be sure, glancing at my phone. 11:42 p.m. The lights had been off for over an hour. Perfect. The gate creaked softly as I pushed it open, slipping into the backyard. I'd chosen this house for a reason. No dog, had an alarm system that I could easily defuse, and a sliding glass door with a lock I could easily pick. I put on my gloves and started working on the door, and within 2 minutes I was in. Inside, the house was dark and still. My eyes adjusted quickly as I took in the layout. Living room to the left, kitchen straight ahead, a staircase leading to the second floor. My heart raced, but it was the familiar thrill of the job. The rush of knowing I was in someone else's space with their belongings at my fingertips. I made my way through the living room, careful to step lightly. No need to rush. I'd start upstairs, go through the bedroom, grab anything valuable, then be on my way out. Easy peasy. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, something caught my attention. A door, half open at the end of the hall. The smell hit me first. It was not rotten or bad, but smelled more like a strong disinfectant, like bleach or formaldehyde. I couldn't tell for sure, and it made me want to know more. I flicked on my flashlight and shone it down the narrow staircase. I realized it was a basement, but something was off. Way off. I descended the stairs slowly, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the walls. At the bottom, the basement opened up into a larger room, but this wasn't the kind of basement people used for storage or laundry. The floor was smooth, polished concrete, the walls lined with thick soundproofing foam. A large metal table sat in the middle, surrounded by strange tools, scalpels, pliers, some other instruments I didn't recognize. And on the shelves lining the walls, glass jars. Dozens and dozens of them, neatly arranged, each one holding something small and twisted. I stepped closer, holding my breath as my flashlight revealed their contents. Locks of hair tied into little knots floating in some kind of liquid. And not just hair, other things too. Fingernails, teeth, eyeballs. I stumbled back, my heart slamming in my chest. My hand knocked into something on the table, sending it clattering to the floor. It was a book. I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling as I flipped it open. It was an album. The first photo was of a woman mid-20s smiling into the camera. The next page showed her again, but this time her smile was gone. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, and her hands were bound behind her back. The third photo, she was dead. The life drained from her face, her skin pale, her mouth frozen in a final silent scream. And the same thing repeated over and over with each time, the victim being a different person. I slammed the album shut, bile rising in my throat. At that moment, I realized of all the houses I had at my disposal, I picked one that belonged to a serial killer. And then I heard something that made the hair at the back of my neck stand on end. A soft whimper, faint but unmistakable. I turned, sweeping the room with my flashlight, and froze. In the far corner, strapped to a metal chair, was a woman. Her wrists and ankles were bound, and duct tape gagged her mouth. Her eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto mine. She was alive. I rushed to her, ripping the tape from her mouth. She gasped, trembling, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Please, help me," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "He's coming back." Ice filled my veins. I fumbled with the ropes binding her, my hands shaking so badly that they kept slipping. Her eyes darted toward the stairs, terror creeping into me, spreading like wildfire. We had seconds, maybe. Then we heard it. Not footsteps, but the quiet hum of a nearby TV screen flickering on. It showed grainy footage from cameras inside the house. Each room, each window. One by one, we watched as the windows sealed themselves, thick metal slabs sliding into place with a heavy finality. Doors slammed shut and locked as if triggered by some automated system. Slam, 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 everything was locking down as if a failsafe had been activated. We were trapped. Panic clawed at my throat. I spun around, my flashlight flickering just as the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairs. "No, no, no," I whispered, backing away. Then he appeared. The man who clicked those dreadful photos, the homeowner. He stood at the foot of the stairs, calm as death, with a look of twisted amusement. His eyes flicked between me and the woman, as if deciding who to kill first. In his hand, he held a long, gleaming knife. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and almost disappointed. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. If I had any chance of escape, I'd have to get past him first, and even then, the whole place was sealed shut. He started down the stairs, slow, savoring every moment. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a metal rod, and held it in front of me, desperate. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. "Stay back," I shouted, but my voice wavered, unconvincing. He smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that sent chills down my spine. "You don't understand," he said, voice calm, almost playful. "This is my home. You're the intruder." Before I could react, he lunged at me. I swung the rod with everything I had, but he was too fast. His knife slashed across my arm, sending a searing jolt of pain through me. Blood poured from the wound, staining the floor, and I fought to stay on my feet as dizziness washed over me. At that moment, I realized I wasn't getting out of here alive. Not in this basement. Not against him. He lunged again, knocking the rod from my hands. It clattered uselessly to the floor as I fell back, crashing hard. The air rushed out of my lungs as he pinned me down with his foot, pressing against my chest. The knife glinted in the dim light, raised slowly, aimed at my throat. This was it. Time slowed as I braced for the end, watching the blade descend. But then, she appeared out of nowhere. The woman I'd freed, bloodied and trembling but alive. She swung the rod I'd dropped with all her strength, a raw, primal scream ripping from her throat as the heavy metal connected with the back of the killer's skull. The crack echoed through the basement. His body crumpled on top of me, unconscious, his knife clattering to the floor. I shoved him off, gasping for air, my chest heaving. Together, we bound him to the metal chair, making sure he couldn't move. His head lolled to the side, blood dripping from the gash in his skull. He was out cold, but we didn't take any chances. The house was still locked down, but the woman, her name was Sarah, knew how to disable the security system. She'd been watching him, learning. Within minutes, the doors clicked open. We didn't waste a second. We ran, through the basement, up into the house, and out into the night. Cold air finally hit my face like a slap, and for the first time since stepping into that nightmare, I felt like I could breathe again. My arm throbbed, but I didn't care. We reached the street, and Sarah, with trembling hands, started calling the cops with the phone she had retrieved from the killer's pocket while tying him up. I simply collapsed onto the curb, staring up at the night sky, rain falling in soft droplets. I was alive. I had come so close, too close. But I made it. As the distant wail of sirens grew louder, I closed my eyes, whispering a silent thank you to God, and quietly slipped out of there before the cops arrived. I'd been reckless, greedy. I'd walked into the wrong place thinking it would be easy. But I survived. After that night, I never developed the urge to rob again. Hey everyone, name's George. Ever since I was a little boy, I've wanted a pet cat. My parents, however, are allergic, so I was never able to get one. Now that I'm going off to college, I've been given the opportunity to finally have one. I have already gotten myself a place to myself that allows pets, and after setting up the small apartment with my things, I get ready to head off and get myself a cat. I get to the place that I have forgotten the name of. I think it was a local shelter. But anyway, I enter the building and give them the information about who I am and everything, and that I want a cat, after getting information settled. We head back and I start looking for a cat. In the corner of the room, in a small room full of cats that is located behind a window, there's 2 cats. The woman showing me the cats says, "Here we have Callie and Sadie. They are inseparable and it appears they have an interest in you." This is good, yes? Oh yes, it's good to have them interested. Now, if you want one of them, you will need to get them both. We tried separating them and, well, I'm not allowed to tell you what happened. Okay, thanks for the information. I guess I will take them both. You're in luck because you get one for free. Here's your paper and your crate to take them home. Wait, only one? Never separate them, keep them in the same crate. All right, don't separate them, thanks. I head back over to the case with my cats, and the woman helps me open the case, and the cats jump out and just sit there, just staring up at me. They do that. They are very well behaved, says the woman helping me. I put the crate onto the ground and they look to the crate and then back at me, then the woman. Go on, you two, get in the crate. Then they both got into the crate and just sat there. I got the rest of things taken care of for cat adoptions, then left to go home. After getting to the apartment building and going into my room, I open the crate's door and they both walk out, sit in front of me and just look up at me. I feel almost compelled to talk to them, and so I do. All right, you two, this is your new home. I hope you two like the place. It's nice, I guess. Callie and Sadie both look around in unison, then lay their eyes on the couch in front of my TV. They then shift their eyes back to me like they are asking permission almost. You want to sit on the couch with me? Both cats chirp in unison with my answer and start walking over. I sit down and they both jump up, go to each side of me as close as they can get and start loafing. Just watching TV. And that's all we did for the rest of the day. Call me whatever you like. I don't think this is normal for cats to do. In my research about cats, I found they are independent and are normally mischievous. So why are my cats just sitting in front of me, just staring? And why can't I separate them? Please tell me what you think. I don't know cats enough to know if this is normal. Am I possibly in danger? I don't know, all I know is my cats keep staring at me in strange ways. I can't stop thinking about the oracle. The memory of that day has corrupted my every thought. On good days, I might be able to stop thinking long enough to eat or change clothes before the anxiety cripples me back into submission. Today is not a good day. A lot of days are not good days. So if these are the thoughts I'm stuck with, then they're the ones I'll write. I had just moved away to start college. My mind was filled with what-ifs. What if I get lost on campus? What if I don't like my classes? What if I can't make friends? But after a couple of weeks, my nerves subsided as I got settled into my new routine. It was a sleepy little college town, surrounded by a sea of yellow cornfields and family farms. The people were nice enough, and on the surface I had nothing to complain about. Until a couple weeks in, when I noticed the whispering. Initially, I wrote it off. I assumed it was just people whispering about me being new to the area, and that as the semester went on, I'd become more than just the new girl. But it didn't stop. Even well into my first semester, people who I thought of as friends, or at least classmates, still whispered to each other whenever I was around. I know what they kept whispering now. From the day I arrived, the question on everyone's lips was, has she met the oracle? I first learned of her from a note that was snuck into my backpack. It was a yellow index card that said, "The oracle would like to see your future." It listed a new Drexel address, a time and date, and then said, "Bring an offering." I thought it was some weird small-town joke. After I had found the note, the whisperers turned their questions to me. I couldn't walk into a room without at least one person seeing me, briskly walking over, and then whispering in my ear excitedly, "Have you gone yet?" or "Have you met her?" They were so eager to talk about her. One told me that he got winning lottery numbers from her. Another left his day job to start his own company because she saw it in his future. Another met her now husband because of the oracle. All success stories, all happy endings. I was skeptical. It was all so weird. I told myself I wouldn't go, but whether it came from curiosity or boredom, one Friday night, I found myself taking endless lefts and rights through the back roads lined with cornfields. In my passenger seat, I had the now worn-out index card with the address and a brand-new family-size package of Oreos. No one would tell me what kind of offering an oracle would want. But who doesn't like Oreos? I'm not sure what I expected, but it wasn't what I found. Pulling up to the address, I took a long dirt path surrounded by trees that gave way to a large clearing where two double-wide trailer homes sat, private and hidden. The yard was a mess of old and new. An old plastic slide and playhouse were faded from years out in the elements. Yet next to them was a brand-new playground structure made of beautiful dark wood. The green plastic slide looked shiny and inviting, and the swings were pristine with their chains clanging softly in the breeze. I turned my attention to the houses. Between them was an awning in which two cars sat parked, a beat-up Jeep Wrangler and a sporty-looking BMW. Before I noticed her, she was in front of me, holding out a hand to shake. She was a younger girl. We must have been around the same age. She wore a dirty work shirt and stained overalls. Brown hair lied braided behind her back. Brown eyes looked up at me expectantly, waiting for me to shake her hand. I was about to explain myself and tell her that I was looking for the oracle, but she cut me off before I could open my mouth. "Hi, Elise, I'm Alex, but you've probably heard of me as the oracle. Nice to finally meet you." Wordlessly, I shook her hand. "Come inside, you can sit on the couch while I freshen up. We'll be in the left house," she said. And without any further discussion, she turned and began walking away. I followed her, but before I got to the door, she turned and said, "Don't forget the Oreos, double stuff is my favorite." When I walked in, I was greeted by a small, cozy home. To the left was the kitchen, and to the right was a small dining room table, old and worn with beat-up chairs to match. Walking past the table, I found the living room, furnished with luxury couches that were almost too big to fit the space. I sat and was faced with a large television that was nearly the size of the wall it hung on. I heard the shower running. It acted as brown noise as my mind began to wander. I thought about how strange it all was. Some girl living all the way out here can see the future? I didn't believe her. Not at first. Even though she knew my name, I explained that away. I assumed one of the whisperers had told her. I hadn't told anyone about the Oreos, but eventually I figured that she had seen them in the passenger seat of my car. A loud tearing noise pulled me from my thoughts. I realized she was in the kitchen now, opening up the package of cookies. The shower was off. I don't know how long it had been off, but it was off. She was dressed in a different outfit of t-shirt and overalls, cleaner but still stained with dirt and car grease. Her hair was dry. "So," I began, but I wasn't sure what to say. I remember being thankful that she cut me off again. "Hey, sorry to leave you sitting there. I knew you would be here sometime, but I didn't know when." "How did you know I would come here at all?" "I saw it," she said simply. The words hung in the air for a beat, then another. "You have questions, I'm sure. They always do. Would you sit with me? I can explain what I know," she said, motioning to the beat-up dining table. I remember I was unsure about whether I should sit down. I had thought about just leaving, that this was just some scam. But then I blinked and I was sat facing her. A large candle sat between us with a lid on top. She was speaking about something and must have been deep in thought. Her eyes didn't meet mine as she continued on. "Like I said, I don't get to control what I see or how far. Without anyone, I only get dreams. Fragments of thousands of futures that I can rarely make sense of. But when I have someone else here, I can see into the future through them. That's why I love new guests. Now the visions are a sure thing. Fate or destiny or whatever you want to call it. It's fixed. It's just yet to be lived." She paused for a moment, then made eye contact with me again. "Sorry if I was rambling. Does that answer your question?" "I'm not sure," was all I could say. "You might be feeling a little disoriented, but that's normal. It's this property. The land has something about it. Feels like you're in a fog sometimes. Can I get you some water or anything?" I remember this moment. It fills me with regret, anger, resentment. I didn't know when she started talking or how much I missed, but I was sure that something was wrong. I didn't remember sitting down. I didn't remember asking her a question. I felt high. I felt so far from anything real sitting at that shitty table. And I meant to tell her. I meant to say that I felt ill, that I had cold feet, that I needed to leave. I opened my mouth. The words started. And then the blinds were closed and the room was dark. The candle flickered as our only light. We held hands above the table together like a seance. She was telling me to look deeply into her eyes and only into her eyes. We both sat leaning forward. She stared into my eyes and I stared into hers. The candlelight flickered. She bore into me with intensity. Her brown eyes looked darker in the candlelight. I was waiting. My lungs burned and I realized I had been holding my breath. I exhaled and waited. Another moment passed. Then the room began to glow. It was soft at first, an orange light that draped gently over the room. I looked around for the source. To my surprise, the candlelight was merely a whisper, and the blinds were still drawn. "Look at me. I can't see unless you look into my eyes," the oracle reprimanded. I looked back at her and her eyes emanated a faint orange light. "Look deeper," she instructed. I obeyed. Her irises had changed from a common brown into something more. The orange became brighter, warmer. I heard birds singing. I felt the wind blowing. Everything was calm. Serene. Her eyes were an early summer morning. They turned a shade of green and I heard the leaves rustling in the breeze. It was all brighter now. Hotter. She stared at me with suns for eyes. I strained to keep my eyes open, but I felt compelled to look harder. I saw the clear blue sky of a summer's day, and then that blue gave way to purples and pinks as I watched the sunset. The night came and her eyes twinkled with starlight. We were bathed in the light of a harvest moon. I watched the stars turn until the room began to glow orange again. Days passed in those eyes. Then weeks, and then months. I stared into those kaleidoscope eyes and I watched the seasons pass. The colors danced around the room, gaining speed. I watched the storms gather. Dark, foreboding grays that swirled with intensity and power. Lightning flashed in her sockets and I smelt the rain. I was enamored when she reached the autumn months. The room shone brilliant shades of brown, yellow, and red, and we were buried in the falling leaves. I was lost in the flashing lights of a life I've yet to live, until suddenly it stopped. I found myself at the beat-up dining room table again. I was holding the hands of a stranger with a faint candle lit between us. We were both standing out of our chairs and leaning forward to see each other better. She looked into my eyes and I looked into hers. Her eyes were plain and brown and gripped with fear. "Well, what did you see?" I ventured to ask. My question seemed to pull her back into the moment with me. She threw my hands down as if she were surprised to still be holding them and began to back away from me into the wall. The oracle held her hands to her eyes, covering her face. From behind her hands, I heard a pleading whisper. No, 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 no. What did you see, was all I could ask. She slammed her hands on the table and began to scream. No, 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 no. There were tears in her eyes. Without warning, she had exploded into hysterics. I was frozen, stunned. Too stunned in that moment to stop her as she took her first 2 fingers on each hand and began to gouge out her own eyes, all the while still screaming, No, no, no! She fell to the ground, screaming in defiance. What was left of her eyes hung out of her sockets, and blood stained her face, her clothes, and especially her hands. She was sobbing. I began to approach her. I wanted to help her. I wanted to take her to a hospital. And selfishly, somewhere deep down, I needed to know what she saw. But I never got the chance. A harsh yellow light burst from her now empty eye sockets. It hummed with intensity and poured over me like a nuclear blast. The oracle sprung to her feet and screamed out in horror. Oh God, I can still see it. Without another word, she grabbed the table firmly with both hands and bashed her head against it. Everything around me drowned in the light. Explosions of yellow rattled me with each impact. She screamed and slammed her head again. My skin burned. Slam. My teeth ached with every sickening hit. Slam. Something cracked loudly. My eyes failed me. I saw only yellow, all-encompassing yellow. She screamed out again, a cry of terror, and with a final slam, the light was gone as quickly as it came. The oracle lied dead, an eyeless mess of fear and gore. In every sunrise, in every storm, in every clear sky, I see her ever-changing eyes watching me. At night, when everything is still, I hear my heart beat, pounding away like a skull cracking against wood. And when sleep does finally take me, I see the yellow whispering to me about impossible things that are yet to be. It wasn't my first rodeo in Iraq. In fact, it had been my 3rd deployment there, so I knew what I was heading into. But nothing could have prepared me for what would happen during that night. Ramadi was a city on edge, the kind of place where shadows moved faster than the wind, and every corner could hide an enemy. My team, Rodriguez, Marcus, and Alex, were my brothers in arms. We had each other's backs through thick and thin and were running together for 3 months now. Rodriguez was the jokester, always lightening the mood with some ill-timed gallows humor. Marcus, the quiet strategist, and Alex, the glue holding us together with his unshakable calm when shit began to hit the fan. Despite it being one of the worst places to be during the Iraq War somehow, I ended up in the most boring corner of this place, probably for the better. However, I'd take being blown to bits by an IED or getting a bullet in the head from an insurgent any day over what I'm dealing with now. In retrospect, I should have noticed it immediately. But let's not get ahead of myself. The 3 and me have been through some tough shit together. Firefights where we get dangerously low on ammunition, and can only hope for a miracle because our supplies faded faster than expected. A teammate taking a bullet or a grenade fragment to a vital body part in the seemingly safest situations, or running out of fuel in a dangerous out in the open spot with a piece of shit Humvee that just won't start back up anymore. Recently, though, those situations became increasingly more prevalent. Just for me and my team, though. Upon returning to HQ, all of a sudden, our ammunition supplies were right there in the supply bag. Every other squad in our rather safe part of the city never seemed to take a hit or disturbance, and the mechanic just ended up laughing at us after inserting the key into the ignition and starting the 4-wheeled monster like child's play. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why did we always get the short end of the stick? That sure as shit explained itself fast in the following days, though. It was an unusually hot day when I got separated from my buddies, hotter than anything I've ever experienced before. But that was about the only thing that felt off at the start of that day. Me and the rest of my team were enjoying our time in the chow hall before taking up our duties and being sent out on our usual patrol throughout a couple of streets around our HQ. No weather warnings, no increased insurgent activity. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual bullshit. How often we'd hear this phrase in that shithole of a city. Yeah, right. I thought every single time, for you guys, sure. I knew something was out there waiting for us, for our team specifically, already trying to fuck us, and not in a good way, be it radio interference, a bad leg for one of my guys, or a rogue civilian turned insurgent. It was none of those things. It was something way worse, and it was waiting specifically for me. The sandstorm hit us out of nowhere. Radio interference fucked us at the same time, so it was even harder to communicate with my mates once I lost sight of them. We were spread out more than usual, walking around an outskirt area of the town checking for signs of civilian stragglers. I barely had time to pull the goggles down from my helmet before I could feel my face being harassed by the whipping winds and tiny sand grains trying their best to burrow into my skin. It was hard to breathe, harder than usual, I thought, even after having pulled up my shima for comfort. It was hard to make out anything at all, really, but I could have sworn the sunlight and sky during this storm never looked like that before. An unnatural, very saturated shade of red began to coat everything in sight. I felt scared for the first time in weeks, as in the shitting bricks kind of scared. I was separated from my guys, even though they were just a couple feet away from me moments before. I could hear them, but not see them, and the world seemed to want to swallow me whole right then and there, as if the apocalypse had started just now without any warning signs. I called out to them. Rodriguez, Marcus, and Alex. I could make out their faint yelling, but could never spot their silhouettes in the madness of that sandstorm. I tried to navigate my way back towards the outer edge of the city, trying to find shelter in a nearby building. Trying to make it back to HQ in this sandstorm would be a suicide mission. Bad visibility and exhaustion would make us an easy target, and we'd have no way in hell spotting an IED. Nobody was keen on being torn apart and being sent back home in bits and pieces, apart from maybe Rodriguez, that maniac. I swear I've never seen another soldier who was so hell-bent on pulling off the most dangerous and ludicrous plans and maneuvers, whilst laughing about it in the process, of course. That's where Marcus was probably the exact opposite. Quiet, collected and stern, kind of a poker face, that guy. However, he's a hell of a shot and got us throughout our current deployment with relative safety. Any plan with a chance of one of our guys being in grave danger was immediately dismissed, and even though I'd call him my brother in arms any day of the week, I'm sure he'd save his own skin before taking a bullet for me or Alex if push really came to shove for real. Sure as shit can't say the same thing about Rodriguez. A crazy battle angel, that guy. Then again, Marcus and I have a family back home. Rodriguez doesn't. You go into this hellhole with a different mindset knowing you've got loved ones back home. Like Alex. Alex only has his girlfriend waiting for him back in the States, but shit. It's written on his face that he regrets joining up and being sent on deployment every single day. I think if he was able to, he'd kick the next pilot out of a plane and fly straight back home himself. Rodriguez and Marcus are doing their best to comfort Alex when shit gets rough. But Alex will probably never get accustomed to what it's like being stuck in a war zone. The fidgeting, the instinct to head for cover once a bombardment begins. But most of all, the goodness in his heart is what betrays him. I don't think Alex can kill. I don't think he ever has killed before. He's a pacifist. A pacifist to the point where before pulling the trigger on the enemy he'll hesitate to the point he'll end up getting himself shot. Why'd he join? Maybe money? Maybe peer pressure? Maybe pride? Beats me. I ended up stumbling into a small rundown building. The civilians here have probably been evacuated for weeks already, like the rest of the buildings. Here and there we'd pick up a couple of stragglers, but nothing that we couldn't handle. The windows were barred and light barely shone through the gaps of the wooden boards, which also meant that the wind and sand were mainly being kept away from my current hiding spot. I tried radioing HQ and my team multiple times to no avail, so I decided on sitting this one out. I put down my rifle next to me within reach and huddled up into a corner of the building, making sure to keep the entrances in sight, and waited. The sandstorm assaulted the buildings of the city relentlessly. It sounded like rain on a metal roof, just harsher and more violent. It felt unnatural. Sooner rather than later, I lost track of time. How long had this been going on for? 15 minutes, an hour, multiple? I began to feel tired after a while, as if something was eating up all of my energy ever since I sought shelter here. That storm, something wasn't right. In my mind, all I wanted to do was get up, get my bearings, and get out of here as fast as possible, despite the storm. But what really happened was that I ended up falling asleep. I frantically reached for my rifle after being woken up by Marcus, Rodriguez, and Alex. My eyes needed to adjust to the brightness of the daylight seeping in from the windows, now that the storm had faded. "Brother, we thought we lost you out there," Rodriguez exclaimed with genuine worry in his voice. "You know I'm a tough guy," I joked after being helped up by Marcus. I froze in fear just moments after, though. There was Alex standing in front of me, face pale as ice, pointing my service pistol right at me with his finger on the trigger. "You're gonna need this, I guess," he said. It felt like he wasn't looking at me, but through me, like he was looking at something behind my face and not at my face. I don't know what sent shivers up my spine more. The face that I've never seen Alex look like that, or that he's pointing a loaded gun at me, his index finger on the trigger and slightly pulling on it. "Are you fucked in the head?" I shouted, shoving his hand away from me and gripping the pistol tightly, yanking it out of his hands. "That thing is loaded, man. Get your shit together," I added, stumbling away from him, looking at Rodriguez and Marcus for support. They brushed it off. Rodriguez just said that Alex has always been a little off, and that he's probably just tired from the storm. Marcus agreed with him and decided that it's best not to make a fuss about it. Alex's stare followed me throughout the room. An almost robotic "sorry" escaped his mouth. I only mumbled some curses to myself, adjusted my gear, and made sure I was still in one piece before looking at Marcus. "We ready to head out?" I asked. "Let's get back to HQ. Whatever just happened out there is something entirely different than from what I'm used to. They need to get better weather intel or give us a Humvee that actually fucking works for a change. Going out there on foot during these circumstances is suicide for fresh meat like him." I looked over at Alex, then back at Rodriguez and Marcus. One event like this and he's already losing his shit. This isn't safe. Alex was shuffling back and forth in his boots a bit, trying to get out of my field of vision for some reason. "Hey, do you think hiding from me makes this any less serious?" I shouted at him. During all of my deployments, I never had a friendly soldier intentionally point a loaded gun at me. That was a core principle you never forget. We started walking towards HQ shortly after this fallout. The three of us walked for what seemed 20 minutes, trying to navigate throughout a city block where everything looked the same, and now that the storm had swept over the city, some signs and waypoints weren't where they used to be anymore, just swept away by the unnatural force of that sandstorm. And that's how it started. That's when I heard it from behind me. "Please don't shoot," in a distorted, haunting Arabic voice. I don't think Alex noticed that I saw what he did when I turned around swiftly, visibly disturbed by what I'd heard, but his dominant hand quickly darted away from his holster, which his M9 gradually sank back into. He'd pulled it out, trying to draw it. Did he go completely nuts now? "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, looking at me in a puzzled way. "Did you guys not hear that?" I replied, a shaky tone in my voice. "You sure you're not losing your shit too, Mr. Commando?" Rodriguez joked, raising a brow at me as he turned around but kept walking, both his arms resting on his rifle, which hung from its sling in front of him. I blinked a couple of times, wiping the sweat from my face. That voice made the hairs on my neck stand up. I stopped dead in my tracks and shoved Alex in front of me. "I'm keeping an eye on you now. If you're trying to fuck with me, it won't work, son. You slip up one more time, I'm reporting your ass to command. This isn't funny. Leave the jokes to Rodriguez." Alex didn't say a thing, but only tilted his head in a creepy manner before taking up his position in front of me, and we all started walking again. We found HQ. Well, what was left of it at least. Where camp should have been, there was only the empty building, trash and sand. Not a trace of our squad nor command. Nothing. It felt like a fever dream. We decided to make camp and spend the night here, since the 20-minute walk turned into a 3-hour search mission until we found this place. We were absolutely exhausted. I kept an eye on Alex, and apart from his strange head tilt and occasional awkward breathing, things seemed to be fine again with him. As fine as the circumstances allowed, at least. I closed my eyes to the sound of distant gunfire and occasional numb yelling. Just where were we, and how come we haven't found friendlies? The next few days passed in a blur, the haunting voice still echoing in my mind from yesterday. The gunfire stopped. Not a single shot could be heard. No wind, no choppers or aircraft above us. Still no radio transmission. Something was off with my team, and this city. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't in the real Ramadi anymore. That sandstorm swallowed me up and spat me out somewhere else. Everything about this just felt slightly off. The windows of some huts and buildings were just too intact for the amount of war this shithole had seen. The sky's color was wrong. Water didn't taste the way I remembered it tasting. The expiration dates on our MREs were wrong. And I began to figure out why Alex was acting so strange yesterday, because today he was fine. But Rodriguez was off. He wasn't laughing. He was talking in a numb manner. His movements were devoid of life, and the scariest bit, he kept trying to stay outside of my field of view. Then it dawned on me. The guy showed up right on time, which was a little surprising considering how late I'd called. My car wouldn't start, and the cold snap in the middle of winter wasn't doing me any favors. AAA had recommended a mechanic in town who did house calls, so when I saw the truck pull into my driveway, I was relieved. He was tall, lanky, and wore a navy blue jumpsuit with a patch on the chest that read, Rick's Auto. His truck had the same name printed on the side, so I didn't think much of it. I opened the door as he walked up with his toolbox, his hands shoved into his pockets like he was shielding them from the cold. "You called about the car?" he asked, voice low and gravelly. "Yeah, thanks for coming so late," I said, stepping aside so he could come in. My garage was attached to the house, and I led him through the kitchen toward the door that opened into it. Something about the way he walked behind me made me uneasy. His boots thudded heavily against the hardwood floor, each step deliberate. But I shook it off, probably just tired nerves. We got into the garage, and I gestured to my car, a beat-up old sedan that had served me well until now. "It's not starting. I think it might be the battery or the alternator, I'm not sure." Rick, or whoever he was, nodded and set down his toolbox next to the hood. He didn't say much, which I appreciated at first. I figured he was just focused on his work. He popped the hood and leaned in. That's when I noticed something odd. His jumpsuit looked off. The patch on his chest wasn't stitched in properly. It was frayed at the edges, like it had been hastily glued on or something. And when he leaned forward, I could see the faint outline of another name under it, one that had been scratched off. Do you actually work for Rick's Auto?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He froze for a moment, his hands buried under the hood. Then he slowly straightened up and turned to face me. His face was blank, but his eyes, those dark, glassy eyes, felt like they were drilling holes into me. "Why do you ask?" he said, his tone calm, almost too calm. I swallowed hard, trying to think of an excuse. No reason. I've never used them before, so I just wanted to make sure." He smiled then, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile you see right before something terrible happens. "You don't trust me?" No, I didn't mean that," I said quickly, taking a step back. He turned away and fiddled with the engine again, but I could feel the tension in the room, thick enough to choke on. My eyes darted to the toolbox he'd brought. It was scratched up, dented, and looked like it had been dragged through hell. It didn't match the pristine truck in my driveway. I needed to get out of there. "I'm just going to grab my phone," I said, forcing a laugh. "You know, in case I need to call AAA back." He didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. I backed out of the garage and into the kitchen, my heart pounding. Once I was out of sight, I grabbed my phone from the counter and pulled up the number for AAA. Before I could hit dial, a voice came from behind me. "Looking for this?" I spun around, and there he was, holding my car keys. How had he gotten in so fast? "I thought you said your car wouldn't start," he said, tilting his head. His tone was casual, but his grip on the keys was anything but. It doesn't," I stammered. He stepped closer, and I stepped back, bumping into the counter. "Funny," he said, "because it started just fine when I turned the ignition." My blood ran cold. That didn't make any sense. He hadn't even been under the hood long enough to fix anything. "Who are you?" I blurted out, my voice shaking. He grinned wider this time, his teeth yellow and uneven. "Just a guy who saw an opportunity." I bolted for the door, but he was faster. His hand clamped down on my wrist like a vice, and he yanked me back. My phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. "You really should be more careful about who you let into your house," he hissed. That's when I saw it, sticking out of his toolbox. A knife, its blade smeared with something dark. My stomach lurched as I realized it wasn't grease. I kicked and screamed, managing to break free for just a second. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a cast-iron skillet from the stove, and swung it with everything I had. It connected with a sickening crack, and he dropped to the floor, groaning. I didn't stick around to see if he was out cold. I grabbed my phone, ran outside, and called the police from the driveway. When they arrived, they found him still in the kitchen, dazed but alive. Turns out he wasn't a mechanic. He wasn't even from town. The truck, stolen. The patch on his jumpsuit, a fake. I never found out what his plan was, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never let a stranger into my house again. The countryside gets boring at times. Yet here I am, after years of not visiting, finding myself back here once again. I have to admit, though, it's peaceful. The air is cleaner, and the sounds are so different compared to the city. But I can't shake this strange unease. Maybe I'm just not used to it anymore. It's been so long. Honestly, it's frustrating. It's summer break. I should be home wasting my life watching stupid videos on the internet. But the data signal here is terrible. I blame my parents. Why did they have to take that stupid work trip? It's not my fault. Why couldn't they trust me to stay home for once? I'd have been fine on my own instead of being sent to this godforsaken internet-free place. I've spent most of the day watching my grandparents work on the farm. They wanted me to help, but I faked a stomachache from the trip. It worked, at least for now. By nightfall, I couldn't sit still anymore. I decided to walk to the store, even though it's ridiculously far from here. "Don't stay out too long," my grandfather warned. "The night gets dark fast around here." I nodded just to get him off my back and left. It's been over half an hour now and I'm exhausted. Why do they have to live so far from the only store? I hate it here. In the distance, I spot a bus stop illuminated by a dim light. It looks inviting, so I decide to rest there for a moment. As I sit down, the day's fatigue hits me harder than I realized. My eyelids grow heavy and I begin to drift off. Just before sleep claims me, I think I hear a giggle, a soft, fleeting sound. I must have imagined it because before I can think too much about it, I'm out. How long has it been since I was last here? 5, maybe 6 years? I was just a kid back then, around 10. My mom and dad were always working, so my grandparents took care of me. I even went to the elementary school nearby. Life was simple. Then I moved to the city for high school and everything changed. I've always been a loner, then and now. I don't have much going on in my life. Most of my days are spent watching videos or complaining about life with my small circle of equally unmotivated friends. What am I even doing with my life? I know I'm pathetic, but isn't everyone when they're young? At least, that's what I tell myself to justify it. I'm enjoying my youth even though there's not much to enjoy. A soft giggle breaks through my thoughts, pulling me from the edge of sleep. This time it's clearer, closer, like that of a child. I mumble something dismissive, half asleep, and the sound fades away. My eyes grow heavy again and I slip back into slumber. Then I start to dream. When I was a kid, I remember playing with someone here. A girl. She was my only friend in this quiet place. We used to meet at this bus stop, talking and playing for hours. One day we talked about the future. She asked me what I wanted to do when I grew up. I shrugged and said, "I don't know. Probably just play games." She gave me a look that back then I didn't understand. Looking back, I realize it was disappointment. It reminded me of the way my mom looked at me when I forgot to clean the house while she and Dad were away. When they came back to a mess, I got an earful for being too engrossed in gaming to care. Eventually, I had to say goodbye to the girl. My parents decided it was time for me to move to the city. She seemed excited at first, telling me she wanted to go to the city someday too, but she couldn't, not yet. We talked for hours that day at the bus stop. Then she asked me a question. "Now that you're going to the city, I bet you're going to do some great things, right?" I gave her the same answer I always did. "I don't know. Probably just sleep or whatever." Her face went blank. Then she started crying. I didn't know what to do. I tried to comfort her, but she grabbed my hand, her grip so tight it hurt. She stared at me with a mix of sadness and something I couldn't quite place. Then she pushed me away and ran into the forest, toward where she said her family lived. I tried to follow her, but all I found was a single tree in a clearing. There was no house, no signs of anyone. Before I could search more, I heard a car and my parents calling my name. I never got the chance to figure out what had happened to her. Sitting here now, it's all coming back to me. Her expression, her words, her tears. It's like being here has stirred something long buried. Suddenly I hear it again, the giggle, clearer than before. It sends a chill down my spine. Jolting awake, I look around and in the distance I see her, a girl running into the forest. Without thinking, I get up and follow. My exhaustion vanishes as curiosity and unease drive me forward. The forest grows darker with each step, but I keep going until I reach the clearing. There I see the tree, the same tree from all those years ago. But now it's withered. its bark gnarled and blackened like it's been rotting for decades. Suddenly my head throbs painfully like a vice tightening around my skull. I stumble, clutching my forehead as flashes of memories that aren't mine flood in. Fragments of a life lived long ago fill my mind. I see a girl in the memories. A younger version of her sits with her parents, their faces tired but full of love. They work tirelessly, picking crops, mending fences, and taking odd jobs just to make ends meet. At night, she studies by candlelight, her small hands trembling from exhaustion but refusing to stop. The hope in her parents' eyes keeps her going. Years pass in a blur. Her family finally saves enough to send her to live with her aunt in the city. This is her chance to pursue her dreams and escape the struggles of rural life. I watch her packing her belongings, tears of excitement streaming down her face. She hugs her parents tightly, promising to make them proud. Then the dream shifts. She is waiting at the bus stop, her suitcase beside her. A drunken man stumbles into view. She tries to ignore him, but he gets closer, his shadow looming over her. She tells him to leave her alone, her voice trembling, but he doesn't listen. Everything becomes frantic. The man grabs her, dragging her toward the forest. She screams, clawing at him, but no one hears her cries. No one comes to help. The memory ends as I see her body buried beneath the tree in the clearing, her future stolen in an act of senseless cruelty. I fall to my knees as the memory fades. My body is trembling, and the air feels heavier, pressing down on me like the forest itself is alive. My legs give out beneath me and the world begins to spin. Darkness closes in around me, but before I lose consciousness completely, I hear a voice. "You're still the same person, even after all these years," the voice says. It is soft and childlike at first, but grows sharper, almost angry. Those words echo in my mind as everything goes black. When I wake up, I am leaning against the tree. My body feels ice cold and strangely heavy, and nausea churns in my stomach. I struggle to stand, forcing myself to stumble out of the forest. Each step is exhausting, but somehow I make it back to my grandparents' house. It is the only house for miles, so I know I'm in the right place. I knock weakly on the door. When it opens, my grandparents are there. Their worried faces blur as I collapse into their arms. I cannot explain what happened. I cannot tell them anything. The next few days pass in a haze. I spend my time helping my grandparents and forcing myself to settle into this quiet life. My body still feels strange, but I try not to think about it. When summer break ends, my parents come to pick me up. As I sit in the car, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. For the first time in years, I feel determined. Back in the city, I throw myself into my studies. I meet new people, work harder than ever, and start building a life I never thought possible. People tell me I've changed, but I just smile and say I needed to expand my horizons. After high school, I get into a good university and land a great job. Years pass, and eventually I return to the countryside. My grandparents are older now, and my parents decide to move in with them after they sell the farm and buy a cozy house in the suburbs. Even so, I find myself drawn back to the bus stop. I walk to the clearing where the tree still stands. It looks even worse now. The bark is twisted and brittle, and the branches stretch toward the sky like skeletal fingers. I stand there for a long time, staring at it as memories resurface. Finally, I whisper, "I'm sorry." A cruel smile creeps across my face, and I giggle softly, the sound lighter and more childlike than it should be. Without another word, I turn away and head back toward my grandparents' house to help them move. The girl by the bus stop never truly left, and now neither have I. Me and my best friend Colin experienced something in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia that bothers us to this day. It happened in the summer of 2023. It has taken me till the winter of 2025 to write this, because it bothers us both so much. Some backstory about our friendship, I promise it's relevant. Me and Colin met Lowe's in the gardening section. I was unbelievably obsessive with houseplants and rare plants. He was unbelievably obsessed with reptiles, spiders, and all the other not commonly loved pets. We both had cars we absolutely loved, and it was basically an instant friendship. As we have been friends, he's slowly become obsessed with plants and I have with reptiles. We've basically molded each other into the same person. One of our favorite activities to do is explore nature. We both have an incredible respect and awe for wildlife and just being in the wilderness. We have searched in the deep woods for plants forgotten by people and science. For example, we found and located Virginia's rarest fern species, the walking fern. Look it up, it's cool. To find this, we hiked in uncharted territory for close to 5 hours up and down 2 separate mountains. This is just one of probably hundreds of instances. I think you can imagine our love for plants and wildlife now. Like I said in my intro, we're both from Virginia in the Appalachian Mountain area, which I may add is truly indescribably stunning. I lived pretty in the middle of nowhere, but there was still civilization around me. Colin, on the other hand, where he lived, made it seem he was the only human that existed. He was probably 30 minutes from the closest store, no cell service, and in the deep woods. He lives on a plot of land that's basically 2 entire mountains that are completely untouched by man. As you can imagine, this is the absolute perfect place for us to explore and observe nature in its most pure and true form. Before I start the story of the day we went to the top of the mountain, I'll preface this with we've both seen weird things in the woods, but we really haven't cared. For example, one day we were exploring and all the sounds of nature stopped. We just kind of laughed and said, well, guess it's time to turn back. If I'm being honest here, what we experienced that day hasn't stopped us from exploring in general, just not at the top of the mountain anymore. Our journey to the top of the mountain. I head over to Colin's house early in the morning for a big day of exploring. We wanted the most time to explore, and his house was about an hour's drive, so I got up and got going. Colin's house is nestled in the bottom of 2 mountains. The mountains are stunning and tower over everything. There's a stream that runs in between his house and the mountains. We decided today we were going to explore past his creek. Colin told me a story one time about something very odd that he saw while exploring. He was about halfway up his mountain when he came across a huge tree. The tree was absolutely massive and impossible to miss. As he got closer to the tree, he noticed a few large rocks, then a few more, then a few more, until he saw that these large rocks were made into a circular formation around the tree. He got closer and saw a fresh deer skull that was attached to the tree. He didn't investigate how it was attached, because he was creeped out and left. Now, in a more populated area, this could easily be explained by someone trying to mess with people. But that's not the case. It's quite literally almost impossible to get onto his land. His closest neighbor is miles away, and if there was a trespasser, they would have been caught way before they made it halfway up the mountain. 'Cause us Appalachian people are proud Second Amendment supporters, and we ain't got nothing better to do than look out for people trespassing. All jokes aside, nobody is on his land except him, his dad, and me, which makes this deer skull and rock formation thing ever more bizarre. I told him, hey, let's go look for that deer skull tree. He said, okay, I don't know where it is really, and I told him, nah, we'll find it. After searching for a while, we kind of got sidetracked and went back to our usual, looking for plants, snakes, bugs, all that. As we make it up the mountain higher and higher, it keeps getting more and more steep and rocky. We finally get to this massive rock outcropping. It has several natural springs trickling water over the rocks. The rocks are almost completely covered in moss, and in the moss, ferns, so many ferns, and a rarer species in Virginia too, resurrection ferns. These were by far the largest resurrection ferns either of us have seen and still haven't topped it to this day. After admiring these gorgeous ferns for about 30 minutes, I told Colin, hey yo, we're almost at the top, you ever been all the way up there? He said, maybe once, actually, I don't know. I said, well, let's go, dude. After we left the massive fern and moss rock is when things started to get weird. It was gradually getting more steep, and we both had to get on all fours, so we didn't slip down the mountain. We are so high up that we can't see his house anymore, and it took us a solid 2 hours to get there. We finally reached what we thought was the top. It was a pretty large flat spot in the mountain that was super rocky. Once we realized we weren't quite at the top, we took an exploring break. He went one way and I went another. I found another rock outcropping that slightly covered a rocky area below it, imaging maybe the first 1 foot of a cave. Just enough to keep rain off one person if you really squeezed close to the rock wall. As I came across this weird outcropping, I looked down and saw something that bothered me to my core, and this is when the feeling started. What I saw was a small fire pit. The fire pit wasn't made out of rocks or anything, but you could tell it was definitely a controlled small fire. I called Colin over with a sense of urgency and showed him what I found. He got quiet too. I asked him, did you make this fire, dude? He turned to me slowly and said, dude, I've never been here. I want to remind you of where we exactly were. On the top of one of Colin's mountains, no neighbors, completely untouched land. We both started to feel uneasy, dizzy even. We attributed this to a lightning striking the land, but I think we both knew in our hearts that it wasn't from that, but was the most rational explanation at the time. We brushed it off and kind of forgot about it because we saw some more cool plants. I told him, "Yo, come on, let's get to the top, man." We started hiking up to the top and got there in about 5 minutes. The view was gorgeous, but that stopped pretty quick. We stopped talking for a second, and then we both realized how absolutely silent it was. There was not a single sound. I looked at him and said, "Yo, why is it so quiet?" He said, "I don't know, man, but this is weird. I don't know why it's weird, but it's weird." I told him, "Man, this is kind of creepy. Why does it feel like this?" He said, "I don't know." We stopped talking for about 15 seconds, and within this small time frame, we both were swept with the most intense and pure terror we have ever felt, for what seemed like no reason. We looked at each other like we were on the same wavelength, and then we heard a loud but distant chop. Chop, 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 chop. About 5 seconds passed between the chops. I whispered, "Dude, what the fuck is that?" He looked at me and said, I don't know an animal that sounds like that because that's 100% not a woodpecker." The chopping continued. We whispered to each other, and the only thing we could attribute to this chopping sound was an axe. We started walking towards the sound more. We wanted to find out what the hell this sound was and why we were feeling so terrified. It sounded like it was just on the decline on the other side of the mountain, the side we didn't go up. There was a large pile of sticks, branches, and briars on the way down the other side of the mountain, so we just stopped. When we stopped, the chops got less frequent and louder. Now that we were closer, we now heard what sounded like a dog whimpering between each chop. We both whispered to each other to something of the effect of, "What the fuck, dude?" as we were talking. We also started to experience this immense sense of dread that was now paired with the pure terror. We kept listening, and the chops and whimpering continued until we heard the loudest chop paired with the loudest whimper, and then silence. At this point, we were basically unable to move, paralyzed out of fear. We were able to snap out of it and talk to each other for a second. More of the "what the fuck, dude," until this was cut short. Footsteps, long striding footsteps, were coming up the mountain. I pulled out my phone to record it because there was no way anyone was going to believe us. I was mostly focused on recording the sound because that's what was important at the time. Eventually, the footsteps started to sound closer until it sounded like it wasn't coming from a direction at all. It was everywhere. Once the footsteps started to sound like they came from everywhere, the whispering started. The whispering was not from me or Colin. It sounded like the footsteps coming from everywhere and sounded like it was inside our heads. I kept recording and pointed to my phone to show Colin I was still recording. About 10 seconds after this, we both got an even higher sense of dread and sense of pure terror. I said, "Dude, it's getting dark. We need to get down the mountain now. I don't want to see what this is coming towards us." We started our descent down the mountain. We were all but sprinting, making the journey as fast as we could while still being careful with our footing. We knew if one of us slipped and broke an ankle, we'd be fucked. As we passed the fern and moss rock formation, we both almost instantly felt better. We stopped for a second and started debriefing. I looked up at the top and saw the sun getting lower and lower and told Colin, "Dude, let's talk later, we need to go. Now." We made the entire journey back down the mountain in 30 minutes, about 1/4 of the time it took us to get up. We sprinted into his house, and his dad said, "Damn, what did y'all see? A bear? A cougar?" He chuckled, but then saw our faces. He stopped laughing, and his smile faded as we explained what exactly happened to us. Colin said, "Hey, show my dad the video you took." I said, "Okay, check this out." I pulled out my phone, turned the volume up all the way so he could hear the footsteps and whispering. The video had no audio whatsoever. Me and Colin looked at each other in fear, and I later deleted the recording because of how much it terrified me. Me and Colin don't talk about this experience much, if at all. We still go exploring in the woods and love it with a passion. We just don't venture to the tip of his mountain anymore. Last month, the first report began at around 6:10. It was a little jarring at first. They always have a quick introduction at the start of a broadcast, the upcoming items segment. But my sister wasn't mentioned. There was just something about a school fundraiser, some break-ins, and of course labor policies. Nothing too out of the ordinary. We mainly just used the telly as background noise while we cleaned and cooked. Through the whirring of the vacuum cleaner, I could barely make out what was being said, but when they said her name, it was like someone ringing a church bell. G.A. We paused. I remember my mom looked shaken by it, almost betrayed that the TV would ever say her name again. I've only recently started to process how heavy it all must have been for her. It wasn't easy for me, losing a sister, but I never really believed it could happen to me as well. The kidnapper felt like a boogeyman, a monster that lurked at the edge of nightmares, but to my mom he was just a man. An evil, evil man. And now this news broadcast was bringing all the fear back. She would have been celebrating her 18th birthday today, but her absence leaves a hole in the family. An innocent girl taken from where she should have been at her safest, outside her school, reported the voiceover as B-roll of flowers left near the school played. It cut to a talking head interview of my mom. It was archived from 2014, but it was still enough to sting her. She jumped into the TV, turning it off before she had a chance to hear her own voice. I gave her a hug when I saw how pained she looked. She told me she wished they'd just let her rest. So do I. We weren't sure what to do. The station didn't ask if they could reuse the archive footage, but the legal stuff is hard to interpret. Can they do this? Do they usually do this? Is it ethical to bring back all of this pain for a filler piece? These questions rattled around in my head that night. It's a little lonely here. My dad had to travel across the country to find decent work after COVID, so it's just my mom and I. My partner had to move as well, down the country to accept a generous offer from the University of Reading. And that's enough about my life for now. I suppose this has left us both feeling a little paranoid. See, I want to know if anyone else has seen these broadcasts and also get this all off my chest. But talking about my life in detail scares me. So I'll keep it brief. The next broadcast happened a week later. Wednesday, the 25th of September, 2024. Once again, it came out of nowhere. It was a different station this time. My mom couldn't bear to watch anything on the previous channel after what had happened last time. I was helping her solve a crossword when it happened. The anchor said, "We can show you some footage from the scene of the crime," and we thought nothing of it. Lots of news stations show CCTV footage of a crime, cutting away or blurring before anything too graphic can be shown. This grainy black and white footage showed the gates of a school. A dark-colored car pulled up at the bottom right, which drew our attention to the date, the 18th of September, 2014. We recognized the school, and we recognized who was outside of it. She was being spoken to by a man. My mom screamed at me to turn it off. I knew what it was. I knew what I'd see if I didn't switch the channel. I pressed the button and nothing seemed to happen. Well, the station logo changed. It was being played on all stations. I pressed it again and ended up on live snooker coverage. Although the tension in the room dissipated, the tension of me inside didn't. It was like being pulled out of an oven, only to realize your innards are burning. I'm scared about my mom. There are little things I can do, but I can't pull the pain out of her. The last incident happened recently, and this one made me snap. Somehow they had home video footage of my sister singing to herself. She swung her arms around herself in front of two glass doors, both pure white from the sunlight. Old, shaky video camera footage of her singing, "Today's the day, my big day," in a tinny voice obviously warped by the camera's microphone. This was spliced midway through a quiz show, once again at 6:10. It took me a moment to realize who I was looking at. As I ran to the power button, the footage cut to a clock showing 6:10 with the man saying, "I wanted to be in the papers. I wanted to scare everyone." It must have been his twisted motivation. The footage cut back to the game show, midway through a question. My mom came back into the room after she'd dried her hair. She must have known something would happen at this time, so she took a shower. It was a good idea, because this one would have made her sick. It made me sick too. I called up the station hoping to get them to acknowledge what was happening. I waited on the phone for an hour, knowing it was all probably a waste of time. When I finally got an answer, I explained to the operator about what I assumed must be hijackings. He said he doesn't know anything about it. None of these incidents happened. Okay, so this story originally ended there, with a paragraph about asking for witnesses or recordings of these events. This week, another one happened. We stopped watching the TV around this time, but it got into my computer. I was showing my mom some fun videos on YouTube. There are a lot of travel vlogs showing places my mom and dad used to visit, like the once bustling resort of Skegness. She loved it. I glanced at the clock and I saw it was almost time. It felt like I was hiding out in a bunker or something, waiting for a storm to pass. But this metaphorical bunker wasn't as secure as I'd hoped. It flashed on the screen. Some scribbled child drawings done in flaky crayon. The first was a Navy car, a man made of scribbles, and my sister holding her favorite unicorn toy. It showed the man driving the car on a rainbow as my sister played with the unicorn, all rendered in crayon scribbles. The video wouldn't pause, so I held my phone close to my chest to spare my mother the sight of this. I'm glad I did. I looked back to see if it was all over. It wasn't. The last image showed a crayon drawing of my sister's face, an orange outline with blue scribbles for eyes. Her mouth was injured. It was more detailed than the rest, and a few teeth were knocked out. The top of the image, I think, showed the unicorn toy. I was nearly sick in my mouth. Of course, I checked the video, just in case it was some strange coincidence, but these images were not part of it. There's no way I'm leaving my mother alone. I've told work I'm not coming in. I don't care, they can fire me. Somebody is doing this, and I don't know who or how or why. Nobody has any leads on this so far. It seems like it's just happening to us. So I turned on the TV again, by myself at 6:10. Nothing was shown this time, but the news reporter seemed to deviate from the script. 20 weeks and 10 years ago, at this exact time, at this exact minute, she died. He said much, much worse than that, but that's the gist of it. I had a sick feeling that that was the significance of the time. My mom knew. It was talking to me. We have a strange, military-like routine now. All devices with a screen are turned off by 6:10. PC, TV, laptop. It's strange, the amount of dread 1 minute can cause. Even as we're avoiding it, we're actively thinking about it. Doing a crossword puzzle and performing a little pantomime in your head to distract from what you're actually worrying about. My phone rang this time. I thought it was my dad. That's the image my screen showed. My dad next to a huge gator we saw at Florida. I answered, not sure if I should hurt him by telling him of the events, but I wish I hadn't. She was screaming. I threw the phone away. My mom was shaken and neither of us could take it anymore. We decided that it must have something to do with the broadcast tower. Neither of us are sure if they connect to TV, Wi-Fi, and mobile. But what else is there to do? The local one's not too far from here, in fact. So we arrived there after a short but tense drive, and some security men come out of the building. It was so windy the trees were at risk of coming down. They come out, wanting to see why a suspicious car has got so close to the rusted barrier. We tell them what's been going on, subtly convincing them and ourselves that this is some kind of sick, targeted hijacking. We haven't seen anything happening, they say, coming off as genuine but a little rushed. The trees are going crazy above us, so it makes sense they don't want to be beneath them. It also turns out that TV transmitters don't affect Wi-Fi, so we don't know what's going on. Nobody does. It's December now. We've kept all devices off around the 6 o'clock period. But it weighs on our mind. When you can't do something, it's all you think about. I left my bedroom TV on. I was watching something off Catch-Up, a comedy show a coworker recommended, and my mom needed help. I paused the show and helped her mop the floor. It was a guy's. She wanted to ask if we should tell Dad. He'd be home or Christmas, and he'd find it odd if we started running for the TV at 6 o'clock. I said we should do it, but only if he asks why we're turning it off. I wasn't sure, but I could see how much stress she was under. That day left a crack in our family. So many days of my sister's, and our future lost. And it stung even years later. Then it all gets dragged back. My TV started screaming. It's like it wanted revenge. The image doesn't need describing, but we both saw it. We both ran in and saw it. It was like needles poking my skin when I saw what my screen was showing. I turned away at the sight, curled up against my mom's pounding chest. It cut back to a shot of audience laughter from the comedy show. It's like it was rubbing it in. No, it was rubbing it in. All I remember after that was consoling my mom all night. I sat next to her on the bed. I think what happens next is important, but it may be heavy. I suppose all the pressure got to her. She started talking about how I could move in with my dad or move out. I thought she meant away from this curse, but I saw the handful of pills in her hand and knew what she meant. Painkillers littered the floor. I'm not sure if they were enough to, but she tried to do it. Whatever is doing this broke her. I never let her go after that. I stayed with her all night. She knows I'm here and Dad's here, just a phone call away. Since then, no more of these interruptions have happened. Nobody knows what it was. Some theorists have said it might be a demon or a spirit, but I don't know. Their theories don't match up 100%. I think when I saved her, it gave up. Just like that, it got under our skin, made our lives a living hell, then gave up at the slightest pushback. But even then, this doesn't sit right with me. What about her 21st birthday or her 19th? Has this happened to anybody else? And if it has, why are they so quiet? I last saw my girlfriend around 17 years ago. Although for me it was last week. I know that doesn't make much sense. I'm not even sure why I'm writing this. It's not like anybody will believe it. And even if they did, the truth would only make things worse. I just need to tell someone, anyone, even if that someone is the anonymous hive mind of the internet. Maybe then I'll be able to sleep again. Perhaps even start to move on with my life. I doubt it, though. I don't think I can ever move on from the way I feel right now. So where to start? Well, you can call me Joe. Obviously, that isn't my real name, but for the sake of this story, it'll do. I'm 17 years old in high school. And as for my girlfriend's name, let's go with Iris. Yeah, she had an old-fashioned flower name. Iris and I met around 3 months ago when she transferred into my school. Her short, messy hair was dyed a bright blue. Sections were starting to fade to a peroxide greenish blonde, and her dark roots were coming through. She wore very little makeup, and was always dressed in a black hoodie with the logo of some obscure band on it. Nobody else in our entire school, heck, our entire town, looked like her. I thought she was the coolest girl I had ever seen. I never had the courage to talk to her. Just being around her spawned butterflies in my stomach, and if I thought about starting a conversation with her, they fluttered up into my throat. I'm not the most outgoing guy. I don't have any close friends, and I'm not remotely popular at school. I'm the one hiding in the corner with my earbuds in, listening to emo music that came out before I was born and thinking, wow, these guys really get me. Iris was the one who made the first move. It was early September, a couple of weeks into the semester. I was sitting in the cafeteria, earbuds in, when she sat down opposite me. I saw the flash of her blue hair, and my face immediately flushed bright red. And I only burned brighter when I realized she was looking directly at me. Even worse, she was saying something. I took my earbuds out, my nervous fingers dropping one into my lunch tray, and used every ounce of my courage to look up and meet her gaze. Her eyes were a pale gray with black pinprick pupils, the eyes of a wolf. The eye contact felt like it was causing me physical damage, but I didn't dare look away. "Hey," she said, smiling. She had a small gap between her front teeth. "Mind if I sit here?" "No," I blurted out a little too loudly. "I mean, I don't mind. It's cool." "Cool," she said, her smile widening. "We can be the unpopular kids table." It's true that she was unpopular, not in the same way that I was just ignored. She was actively disliked, mostly by the girls. They said she was a psycho, that she'd been expelled from her last school because she'd smashed up all the windows with a baseball bat, and then kneecapped one of the teachers. Her parents had divorced over it, and that's why she and her dad had moved to this dead-end town. I didn't know if any of that was true. I suspected the girls were just jealous because Iris was cooler than they were. "So what were you listening to?" my crush asked, deftly filling the silence when I didn't say anything. I flushed red again. She was into obscure stuff. She'd think my music taste was basic. MCR, I stammered. I mean, My Chemical Romance." "I know what MCR stands for, bro," she said with a smirk. "Black Parade?" "Oh, Bullets, their first album, Her eyebrows arched, and she squinted at me slightly, like she was trying to read a block of tiny text printed on my face. My heart pounded so loudly I was convinced she could hear it. After several long seconds of studying me, she leaned back in her seat. "You're Joe, right?" she asked. My eyes widened. Oh, God. "Yeah, that's me," I somehow managed. "And you're, Iris." "Like the flower," she confirmed. "Old-fashioned name, huh?" I just nodded. I had no idea how to continue this exchange. At school, I only spoke when a teacher called on me. Even at home, I spent most of my time playing video games by myself in my room. This was already the longest conversation I'd had in days. Iris was still staring at me. I kept staring back, but it felt like every second our eyes remained locked was building up a pressure and heat that would eventually cause my head to explode. "You're pretty nervous, huh?" she finally said, grinning. "Is it because I'm a psycho?" That did it. I finally broke eye contact and stared down at the table. "No, of course not," I replied quietly. "I don't believe any of those rumors anyway." "Well, maybe you should." Under the table, I felt a soft impact against my shin. She'd kicked me, only lightly, not enough to hurt. "Half of those rumors are true, you know." "Oh?" I swallowed loudly. Which ones?" She playfully kicked me again. "Wouldn't you like to know?" "Yeah," I replied, and then before I could catch myself added, "I would like to know more about you, actually." "Hmm?" There was a question in the sound, or perhaps confusion. I froze, head bowed like I was waiting for an executioner to lop it clean off my shoulders. And then she seemed to make up her mind about something and asked, "Well, what are you doing after school today?" And that was how it started. I won't relay every moment of how our relationship went from cafeteria outcasts to romantic partners. It's personal, and it would take too long, and honestly, it's too painful for me to think about right now anyway. The short version is I did meet her after school. We went for a long walk around town and she told me about herself. She really had been expelled for breaking a bunch of windows, although she hadn't broken a teacher's leg. Her parents had divorced, but that had happened a long time before. She had moved here with her dad, but they weren't very close, and mostly stayed out of each other's way. Within a couple of hours, my nervousness around her had all but vanished. She was easy to talk to, and she had this way of listening. She'd ask me a question and then grin, her eyebrows raised as I replied. At first, I thought she was going to make fun of me, and I internally flinched every time I answered one of her questions, but I soon realized that she was just genuinely eager to know more about me. She was hanging on my every word. Why me? Who knows? I asked her that exact question several times over the next couple of months. She'd always just smile conspiratorially. "I have my reasons," she'd say. When I'd start to point out that I was average and boring and skinny and nerdy, she'd punch me lightly in the shoulder and tell me not to put myself down. Maybe she saw something in me that nobody else does, myself included. I guess I'll never know. So yeah, we started hanging out. We'd sit together at lunch, much to the amusement of the other students. I got bullied a little more because of my association with her, but that stopped when Iris noticed. "Anyone says a bad word to this boy, and I smash their fucking teeth in," she announced pleasantly to the entire class, teacher included. She tanked the detention without a single complaint, and nobody bothered me again after that. We'd spend time together in the evenings and on weekends. She didn't want me to meet her dad, so she'd come over to my place. My mom hated her. Like everyone else, she'd heard about the window-smashing rumors and was convinced Iris was a bad influence on me. Iris's dad was a thug too, she said. An alcoholic with a criminal record. Everyone in town knew about it, like father, like daughter, she said. I didn't care. Iris quickly became my entire world. I had never given much thought to romance and had certainly never had a girlfriend before. I'd never even tried. But she made everything so easy. She grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me down avenues of experience I had never even imagined, and I willingly went with her every step of the way. We'd listen to music for hours, talk about our lives, our deepest thoughts and feelings, things too personal to repeat here. My dad had died when I was a kid, and I'd never really spoken about it to anyone until she asked me about it, not even my mom. After a couple of weeks, she knew me more intimately than anyone else in the world. She told me all about her trauma, her attempts. I didn't care that much about her past. She had me now. She'd be okay. As quickly as our emotional relationship deepened, so too did our physical relationship. Our first kiss was on the way back from seeing a movie, under the sepia glow of a streetlight. Honestly, it wasn't very good. Our teeth clacked together loudly. But the second kiss seconds later was incredible, and so was every kiss that ever followed. It was when my mom caught us in my bed one time, our clothes in a pile on the floor, that Iris was banned from my house. "I won't have that happening under my roof," Mom insisted, almost on the verge of tears. She's a very dramatic person. "If you're hell-bent on letting this good-for-nothing girl ruin your life, you can do it somewhere else." "Somewhere else," she said. And that's how Iris and I ended up at the abandoned house on Somerville Street. It was a nondescript two-story house with white wood cladding, right on the edge of town. It kind of looked like the house from the American Football album cover with the second-floor window in the middle of the gable that covered the porch, except the window on this house was diamond-shaped for some reason. I knew that something bad had happened there a long time ago. I'd heard about it as a kid, a murder or something. It had mostly been empty since then, since nobody wanted to buy it. Signs around the house implied that it was to be demolished at some point, but that never seemed to go anywhere. Ever since I could remember, it had just sat there, unused. With both of our bedrooms being off limits, Iris and I wanted to find somewhere we could be intimate. She suggested a lot of outlandish ideas: the school gym, the football field, the dairy aisle of the local supermarket. But when we rode our bikes out to the house on Somerville Street, her eyes lit up. "This is our place," she whispered. "I can just feel it." Despite being empty for a decade or two, the house wasn't in bad condition. A little rundown, with some graffiti tags spray-painted onto the walls, but still entirely intact. It didn't stay that way for long. Iris sauntered up to the house like she owned it and started looking for a way in. Obviously, the doors were all locked. The windows, too. I was just about to give up and suggest we try somewhere else, when she suddenly had a rock clutched in her fist. Before I could stop her, she'd hurled it through one of the windows. The sound of breaking glass was deafening in the quiet neighborhood. I froze in place, waiting for alarms to start blaring, hidden security cameras to swivel in our direction, concerned neighbors to come sprinting around the corner. I listened for distant police sirens growing louder and closer. But nobody came. By the time I unfroze myself, my girlfriend was already halfway through the window head first. I could just see the soles of her Doc Martens as she wiggled through. I murmured something about broken glass and being careful. On the other side, she turned to face me. Her eyes lit up like a slot machine. "Dude, get in here." I'd never trespassed in my life, but there was no turning back now. Careful not to cut myself, I squeezed through the broken window. The second my feet touched the floor, Iris's arms were wrapped around me. "You're insane," I started. But then she kissed me, and whatever half-hearted admonishment I'd been about to give her was forgotten. I was dimly aware of the interior of the house. Amazingly, it was still furnished, although everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. Most of my attention was fixed on Iris, though. Her blue hair glowed in the low light of the house. As if she knew where she was going, she led me up the creaking stairs to the bedroom. The bed was still there, beneath the diamond-shaped window. An hour later, we lay in each other's arms, wondering if we'd get sick from all the dust in the bed. We didn't care if we did, everything was different now. We'd crossed over into a new world together. The fading light through the window shone a diamond spotlight on us. I remember feeling like we were the main characters of a teen love story, and this was our happy ending. I wish more than anything that my story ended here, before everything that came next. Iris got dressed first and dug around in her pockets for her vape. She crossed over to the window. I had assumed it wouldn't open given its unusual shape, but she fumbled with it and it swung aside. A warm, late summer breeze began to drift into the dusty room. "Hey," Iris said. The breeze toyed with her blue hair, and in the evening light she seemed to shine. The sight of her took my breath away, and so did her next words. "I think I love you, bro." I opened and closed my mouth a few times, trying to formulate a response, but she'd already turned away, and to my shock she was climbing out of the window. The triangular gable was right beneath it and didn't have an especially steep incline, so she probably wouldn't fall, but it was still a steep drop if she did. And besides, what if someone saw us trespassing? I jumped out of the bed and scrambled to put my own clothes on. By the time I looked back up, she had gone. I couldn't see her through the open window. Did that mean she'd fallen? Was she hurt? Everything about today had been so perfect, surely it couldn't end like this. I rushed to the window and stuck my head through the frame to look for her, and that's when I felt the strangest sensation, like a wave of vertigo mixed with plunging my head into warm water. I gripped the frame to steady myself and blinked several times, unsure of what had happened. When I looked around, my eyes landed on Iris, crouched on the gently sloping tiles. I breathed a sigh of relief and then noticed the expression she was wearing. She looked confused, her face stuck somewhere between a smile and a question. "What's wrong?" I asked her, but before she could answer, I saw it for myself. It was broad daylight outside. Just seconds ago, it had been sunset. Now the sun was high overhead, and so bright that Iris barely cast a shadow. We exchanged a stunned glance, and then I retracted my head back into the bedroom to get my bearings. There was that sensation of submersion again, and when I looked around, the room was bathed once more in dim orange light. I could no longer see Iris through the window, even though she should have been right there. All I could see was the sunset sky, and then to my amazement one of her boots materialized from thin air, followed by the rest of her. She quite literally appeared out of nowhere as she climbed back through the window. I caught her in an embrace and we stood there together for a long moment, breathing heavily. "Joe," she said, her voice muffled by my chest, "is it just me, or is that window some kind of, portal?" I'd been thinking the same thing. It's not unlike a portal," I carefully agreed. She looked up at me and I watched a wide grin slowly overwrite any apprehension on her face. "Shall we check it out?" she suggested, but I knew it wasn't a suggestion. We stood beside each other at the open window. On the other side, we could see the town through the amber lens of evening. Cars crawled slowly up and down the streets, and people were taking their dogs on a final walk before it got dark. I checked the time on my phone. It was just after 7 p.m. 3, 2, 1. Iris counted down and we both stuck our heads through the window. That watery sensation once again, and then we were looking out at a town brightly lit by the midday sun. Somehow it really was daytime on this side of the window. "What the hell is this?" Iris whispered, but she didn't sound scared. She was giddy with glee. I swallowed. I couldn't disagree that it was exciting, but it was terrifying too. This wasn't an illusion, it was real. Some kind of scientific phenomenon that we had no understanding of, or maybe it was just magic. I scanned my eyes up and down the streets and noticed something else strange. All the cars had stopped. They were just parked in the middle of the road, as if abandoned. And I couldn't see any of the pedestrians that I'd seen just a moment before either. In fact, I couldn't see any activity at all. There wasn't a single sign of life. Iris had already climbed out onto the roof, and before I could stop her, she'd dropped down to the ground. The smart part of my brain was telling me to stop and think before I followed her. But as was often the case when she was around, I ignored it. I landed awkwardly, sprawling onto my back in the grass beside the porch. A moment later, Iris dived on me. We lay together for a long moment, and then she planted a lingering kiss on my cheek and got to her feet. I did the same. It was quiet. Very quiet, in fact. The only sound we could hear was the slight rustle of tree branches in the breeze. There were no distant voices or sounds of traffic being carried by the wind, no buzz of backyard lawnmowers or power tools. We couldn't even hear the chirping of birds. This was a quiet part of an already quiet town, but it still felt unnaturally silent. "Where is everybody?" I whispered. I didn't even know why I was whispering. My voice just came out that way. "I don't know," Iris whispered back. "Let's head downtown, see what's going on." Our bikes had vanished. I wasn't especially surprised by that. The window that Iris had smashed to enter the house was completely unbroken too, and maybe it's just because I was looking at it in daylight, but it seemed like the house was cleaner. Less run down, less graffiti. And hadn't the grass been longer before? More overgrown? As we walked towards the center of town, hand in hand, my unease only grew. We didn't see a single other person, hear a single sound of an animal or even an insect. The sun was high overhead, but it wasn't especially warm. There was a chill in the air that hadn't been there before. We passed several cars just parked in the middle of the road. Doors closed, engines off, nobody inside them. We didn't talk much. I think we were both on guard in case something happened, in case we saw someone, heard something. I'm not sure what I was expecting. A distant scream, the silhouette of someone watching us from a window, but there was nothing. It was just silent and still. It felt like walking through a film set, the houses on either side of us facades with nothing inside them, the cool sun above us a stage light that made everything a little too bright, that stopped the shadows from even forming at our feet. A set that had been cleared of all personnel so the action could begin. But what kind of scene were we blindly walking into? It wasn't until we reached downtown that we realized the full extent of it. It was one thing for residential streets to be empty, but seeing every shop, every cafe, every park and public place utterly empty gave me a feeling of awful foreboding. It's like everybody else knew something that we didn't. My mind cycled through the possibilities. A tornado warning, a devastating new virus, a government-mandated purge, nuclear war, alien abduction, the rapture. Dude. Iris let go of my hand. What the fuck? I snapped out of my doom spiral daydreams and followed her gaze. She was looking into the window of a store. It was full of red balloons in the shape of cartoon hearts. A gaudy banner above them read, Make Valentine's Day 2007 the start of something that lasts forever. We looked at each other. 2007, I repeated. That's the year I was born. Yeah. Iris shrugged and started to head inside the store. It was open, or at least the door was unlocked. Unable to think of anything else to do, I followed her. I told myself that the banner was a simple misprint, that they'd just typed the wrong year, but it was still September. Why would a shop even be advertising Valentine's Day stuff? There was nobody inside, of course. None of the lights were on either. Iris grabbed a box of chocolate from the shelf and tore it open without a second's hesitation. I started to protest, but before I could form any words, a chocolate heart was being pushed between my lips. Despite the ambient anxiety I'd felt ever since we went through the diamond-shaped window, I smiled and bit into it. The bitter taste of ash filled my mouth. Iris's eyes widened as I spat it onto the floor. "Hey," she protested. "That's no way to treat my first-ever Valentine's gift to you." "Try one for yourself," I suggested, and immediately regretted it. What if it was poisoned, contaminated somehow? Maybe by the same thing responsible for the entire town's disappearance. But before I could voice any of these concerns, Iris popped one into her mouth. She chewed it thoughtfully for a few seconds and then spat it into her hand. "Yeah, no," she said, her face all screwed up. "Whatever that is, it ain't chocolate." We wandered back out onto the street. Now that I was looking around, I realized that most of the stores were different from the ones I knew. A cafe that I visited often had a different name and layout. There was a Blockbuster Video, which I'd only seen in old pictures online. I think they went bankrupt about a decade ago. I pulled out my phone to Google it, but it had no signal. Neither did Iris's. It was looking more and more like we'd gone back in time. But where was everybody? Why was the entire town empty? Had there been some kind of emergency back in 2007? I'd never heard of anything like that. We wandered into a restaurant. The lights were all out, but there was cooked food laid out on the tables, some of it half-eaten. I nervously nibbled a slice of pizza, but it had the same chalky ash-like texture as the chocolate. We tried turning the lights on, but the power seemed to be out. Returning to the street, I was at a loss as to what to do next. But Iris had her own ideas. For the second time that day, the sound of breaking glass startled me out of my daydreams. I looked over at her, horrified. She'd tossed a trash bin through the window of a jewelry store. Smashing the back window of an empty house was bad enough, but this was criminal vandalism in broad daylight. "My mom was right," I told her. "You are a thug." I was smiling, but she'd started to scare me a little. "And a thief," she happily agreed. She snatched an expensive-looking pendant from the window display and put it around her neck. It had a blue gem that matched her hair. A sapphire, I assumed. It looked great on her. But my growing anxiety about being in this lifeless place made it hard to appreciate. "I think we should go back," I said. "I don't want to get stuck here or whatever." "Oh," Iris protested. "An entire town with nobody except me and you in it sounds like heaven to me." She wrapped her arms around me and we kissed long and deep. I broke it when I had the sudden mental image of someone watching us from the alleyway across the street. "Come on, let's go," I insisted, and seeing how restless I was getting, she didn't resist. We walked back to Somerville Street, down empty roads dotted with empty cars, past buildings with all the substance of cereal boxes, beneath a sun that never seemed to move. My mind kept playing tricks on me, creating dark figures watching us from behind trees and buildings, but when I looked closer, there was never anybody there. My biggest fear was that we wouldn't be able to return to our own time, that we were stuck here, alone in a world without people or power or edible food. But when we climbed back up the porch and through the diamond-shaped window, that wobbly feeling washed over us again. And then everything went dark. I fumbled for my phone and managed to turn the flashlight app on, and we saw that we were back in the bedroom, just as we'd left it. My phone was working again and now claimed the time was 9 p.m. Outside the open window, we could see the moon, see the lights of cars moving on the main roads, hear the low hum of traffic and the chirping of nighttime insects. I carefully closed the window and we quietly made our way back to the ground floor. The window we'd entered through was still broken, and we squeezed through it to find our bikes where we'd left them. "Let's keep this to ourselves," Iris suggested as we picked our bikes up. "There's like a whole other world through that window. Nobody else has to know about it, right?" "Yeah," I agreed. I had the mental image of a vague yet menacing government agency sweeping in to claim it for themselves. Teams of scientists taking soil samples from the past, stuff like that. If this was an actual portal through time, then it could be dangerous if the wrong people got their hands on it. The worst that Iris would do was break a few windows and steal a necklace or two. "Hey," I said, suddenly realizing something. "Did you take that necklace off?" "Huh?" Iris's hands went to her throat, and she felt around for the sapphire pendant she'd taken from the jewelry store's window display. It wasn't there anymore. "Weird," she whispered. "Maybe it came loose while we were climbing up the porch, but I'm sure I fastened it properly." "We'll look for it next time," I promised, and the words "next time" sent a shiver of nervous excitement through me. Now that I knew we could safely come back, the prospect of exploring this mysterious new world suddenly seemed a lot more fun. I gazed at my girlfriend. "Today was incredible," I told her. "I mean, even before the whole time portal thing. You're incredible, and so is every moment we spend together." My voice faltered nervously. "And I love you too." "Fuck yeah, bro," Iris sang, grinning wide and wrapping her arms around me. We headed home after that. And after enduring my mom's interrogation about where I'd been, I booted up my computer and did some research on the Somerville Street house. An ice-cold tendril coiled itself around my spine as I read the article. I immediately messaged Iris. There really had been a murder in that house. On February 10th, 2007. In the very bedroom where I'd lost my virginity just a few hours ago. The owner of the house, one Hector Strenz, had strangled his wife Madeline after suspecting her of infidelity. He'd fled the scene and taken his own life before the police could take him in. We texted back and forth about it all night, wondering what it meant. Had Madeline's demise in that room somehow created another version of the outside world, frozen on the day of her death? It was a ridiculous concept, something out of an old X-Files episode. But there could be no explanation for this that made any logical sense. We had more fun talking about what we could do there. We'd been looking for a place to be together without fear of interruption. Now we'd found an entire town with nobody in it, and it didn't seem to be dangerous. We hadn't been attacked or stopped from leaving. Neither of us felt sick from trying the chalky food we'd found. It had been creepy there, sure, but that's just because it was so empty and silent. It reminded me of the liminal spaces I'd seen online, empty offices and public places that felt like all the life had been siphoned out of them. But in those stories, you couldn't leave, and there was always some monster stalking you. Iris was especially excited about the things we could bring back with us: money, clothes, jewelry. They were all just laying there, unclaimed. The thought of stealing made me uneasy, but was it actually stealing if it wasn't owned by anybody? Would taking them from the past make them disappear in the present? There was no way of knowing without trying it out. We even came up with a name for the place: Uncanny Valley. It was technically inaccurate. The uncanny valley is the feeling you get from seeing something that is almost human-like but not quite right, like a detailed video game character whose animations are slightly wrong. The term doesn't apply to places, but we liked the name, so it quickly stuck. The following afternoon, after school, we made our second visit to the house on Somerville Street. We came prepared this time with food and drinks in backpacks and a collapsible stepladder that Iris had borrowed from a neighbor's garage. We learned a lot that day. We learned that time doesn't pass in Uncanny Valley. We stayed there for hours this time, and the sun didn't move an inch. It was always suspended directly above us. But time continued to pass in the present. When we went back through the window, it was the middle of the night. After my phone connected to the network again, I got a dozen furious texts from my mom asking why I hadn't come home. Phones didn't work in the valley, nothing did. There was no signal. We tried taking photos, but they all came out as indecipherable smears. There was no electricity either. The cars were all dead, not that either of us could drive. All food and drink found there tasted vile and seemed to have no substance to it. Even tap water tasted bitter and alien. The picnic we brought with us was fine, though, so we ate that in the park. With the folding knife that she always carried, Iris carved our initials into a nearby tree. I+J 4EVA, inside a rough-hewn heart. We also learned that nothing we did there was permanent. The jewelry store window that Iris had smashed last time was completely intact, and the pendant she'd stolen was back in its display. She took it again, shattering the window with a blissful smile on her face. A shard of flying glass sketched a rough red line on her cheek. That feeling of foreboding returned, at least to me. Iris never seemed scared, and I never admitted my fears to her. It just always felt like someone was watching us, like if I turned my head just a little faster, I'd see them. Inside buildings, floorboards creaked as if someone were quietly creeping along the corridors. I told myself that it was just the emptiness and silence. I remembered staying in a hotel at an airport once when I was a kid. You could only get to it via a bus from the terminal, so the only people there were those who were going to fly early the next morning. It was almost entirely empty, and the complete silence of the place, disproportionate to its staggering size, had terrified me. Uncanny Valley gave me the same vibes. But ultimately, that hotel hadn't been dangerous, and this place didn't seem to be either. There were no noodle-armed anomalies here, no swarms of little Pac-Man monsters appearing over the horizon to devour us. Nothing. I swallowed down that unsettling feeling, and after a while I actually began to enjoy myself. Side by side, Iris and I explored the empty town with no real agenda in mind. We opened dozens of books in a bookstore, finding all of the pages blank. We visited cafes where cold cups of half-finished coffee still sat on the tables, like the customers had just abandoned them and left. Moving back towards the residential area, we entered people's homes, finding them frozen in time, meals half-cooked in their kitchens. "How far do you think this goes?" I asked my girlfriend as we wandered the streets. "What do you mean?" She was checking that the sapphire pendant was still in her pocket. It was, and she smiled. "How far what goes?" "I mean, it seems like the entire town exists here," I mused. "Or like a facsimile of it does, but does the entire world exist? If we just kept walking, would we get to other towns, other states?" My mind was reeling with the possibilities. Is there an empty copy of Times Square just sitting there in total silence? A lifeless record store in some Hong Kong alleyway? Is there a deathly quiet copy of, like, the Amazon rainforest out there somewhere? What do you think? I looked at her and she grinned at me. "I think you're cute," she chirped. "My cuteness has nothing to do with this," I replied, trying not to smile. "I'm asking a very serious question about the underlying mechanics of this supernatural world we've discovered." "Well, I don't know about any of that stuff," Iris responded, "but I do know you're cute, so I'm qualified to make that claim." I put my arm around her shoulders and squeezed. "It's interesting though, right?" I went on, thinking about the mechanics of it, how it works, and where it came from. "I guess." Iris didn't sound too convinced. "I just think it's cool, you know? It's so empty. No parents, no teachers. You could disappear in here and nobody would ever find you." I was about to say something when she stopped walking. "We're here," she announced. She pointed at a nearby house. "This is my place." I raised my eyebrows in surprise. I thought we had just been wandering the town at random, but apparently she'd had a destination in mind. The house, she pointed out, was unremarkable, the same as all the others around it. I followed her to the front door and we found that it was unlocked. "Oh, weird," she remarked as we looked around the living room. "It's all different." This would be how the house looked 17 years ago, I realized. Would Iris have even been born in February 2007? I realized then that I had no idea when her birthday was. We still had a lot to learn about each other. "Well, it's still my house," Iris declared. Her eyes glinted mischievously as she looked at me. "So let me show you my room." Our second time together was a lot less dusty than the first. I felt bad for whoever's bed we'd done it in, but then realized they didn't really exist anymore. Whoever had lived in this room was now 17 years older, and somewhere else in the world. The real world, or the present, or whatever you wanted to call it. Thinking about it made my head hurt, but in a satisfying sort of way. I looked down at Iris. She was snuggled into my chest, her shoulders shaking. I couldn't see her face. "Hey," I whispered, ruffling her messy blue hair with my hand. "You good?" "Yeah," she whispered back. She looked up at me and blinked several times. A couple tears rolled down her cheeks, but no more followed. Slowly, very slowly, she smiled again. "I love you," she said. Her wolf-like eyes were gazing deeply into mine, and I knew without doubt that she meant it. "I love you too," I murmured, and I meant it too. She stretched and yawned in my arms. The sterile light from the static sun shone through the bedroom window, and all was silent. Nothing moved in the entire world. Tired from a full day of adventure, we headed back to Somerville Street after that. But instead of using the stepladder to climb up onto the porch, we broke in via a window on the ground floor, like we had in the present. The house was much the same inside, a little more lived in and a little less dusty, but the bedroom floor was covered in blood. Oh, fuck, Iris gasped, as we both stared down at the roughly human-shaped pool, glistening in the bright light admitted by the open diamond window. It looked fresh and wet. Nope, no, Iris continued, wheeling on her heel and charging back down the stairs. Not doing this. I was only a second behind her, swallowing my heart back into my chest. Outside, we quickly climbed the stepladder to the house's gable. The window was open. As I was about to dive through it like a darting salmon, Iris reached into her pocket and took the sapphire pendant out. I gaped at her. We'd just seen something right out of a horror movie, and she was worried about dropping her stolen necklace again. Despite the terror I felt, I insisted on sending her through the window first, and that's when we found out what had happened to the pendant last time. As the hand holding it approached the window, it began to tremble. Alarmed, Iris uncurled her fingers. In her palm, the necklace was vibrating violently. "What the?" she started to say, and then it vanished entirely right before our eyes. "We don't have time," I urged her and ushered her through the window. I followed, my head swimming as we passed through the threshold, and then we were in darkness. We had returned to the present. It took us a while to return to the valley after that. The memory of the blood on the bedroom floor kept us away. But after a week or so, unwilling to remain in mundane reality and desperate to spend some time alone, we cautiously returned. The town had reset itself once again. The jewelry store window was stubbornly unsmashed, and the sapphire pendant was back on display. Iris didn't bother stealing it a third time. The initials she'd carved into the tree in the park had disappeared too. "So much for forever," she remarked, running her fingertips over the unbroken bark. I put an arm around her. "Forever sounds pretty good to me." When you say that you'll love somebody forever, you're really saying it because it feels good in the present. You embrace each other on a day that feels like it's going to last an eternity, and you can easily imagine a lifetime of those days. Millions of shared moments. But ultimately, we have no way of knowing what the future will look like, or who will be in it. You can easily return to the past, apparently, but no one is there anymore. Perhaps there's no one in the future either. Maybe all that really exists is the moment you're in right now. We made love right there in the park. There was nobody to see us or stop us. "I want to break something," Iris announced as we lay together on the grass. She dressed, stole a baseball bat from a sporting goods store, and began to smash every single window she could see. The harsh scream of breaking glass echoed through the silent streets. I watched from a distance, smiling, wanting to stop her. When she was finally satisfied, she sprinted over to me, her wolf eyes alert and alive. She had shallow cuts all over her hands and face. "Feels so fucking good," she hissed. "God, I love it here." We started visiting the valley more and more after that. We never went back to the bedroom with the blood on the floor. But it felt like we explored every other inch of the town. We poked around dozens of houses, snooped around every store. We made love in countless places, growing bolder and bolder over time. The middle of streets, the main exhibit of the art museum, the school gym, the football field, the dairy aisle of the local supermarket. Iris's appetite for destruction continued to grow. She left broken windows in her wake like a trail of glass breadcrumbs. She smashed entire houses to pieces. She would often cry. I wasn't brave enough to broach the subject with her. I'll never stop regretting that. We tried to bring more things back with us, but it never worked. They would all just vanish. Even stolen clothes that we were wearing would disappear right off our bodies. Only the things that we took with us could come back through the window. After a while, we stopped trying. One time, we took our bikes with us. Squeezing them through the window and getting them down to the ground was more trouble than it was worth. We rode for miles out of town, but there was nothing there. Just more empty world. It was like loading up a multiplayer video game by yourself. Wandering these huge spaces that should have been full of sound and action but were just inert backdrops without the actors to create those scenes. I visited my own house once, but it was awful. There was nobody there, of course, but it was clear from the layout that my dad had been alive at that point in time. My room had a baby's crib in it. Being in there felt like someone was standing right over my shoulder. I had a powerful mental image of me as a baby, looking up out of my crib and seeing me as a 17-year-old, staring down at myself. It was so vivid that I wondered if it was a memory just now resurfacing, an infinite cycle of terrified eye contact. I ran out of the house and never went back. In the present, things were bad with my mom. It was hard to keep track of time in the valley, so I often ended up returning home in the early hours of the morning. None of her texts or phone calls ever went through, and she assumed I was turning off my phone to deliberately avoid her. And when she demanded to know where I'd been, I couldn't tell her. What was I supposed to say? My grades at school slipped. I didn't really care. I just wanted to be with the girl I loved. One day Iris didn't show up at school. The teachers hadn't heard from her, and my text didn't go through to her phone. There was only one place she could have gone. But she'd never been there without me, at least not to my knowledge, and I'd certainly never been there without her. The thought of walking those silent streets alone gave me shivers. Of course, I did it anyway. After the endless school day finally ended, I rode my bike to Somerville Street, hid it behind the house, entered through the back door we had left unlocked, and climbed the stairs to the second floor. I couldn't stop thinking about that pool of blood. It had looked so thick and warm, like spilled soup, steam rising from it as it cooled in the cold winter air. I climbed through the diamond-shaped window. It felt like my head slowly rotated 180 degrees, and then I emerged, blinking, into the flat light of a February afternoon. I slid down the ladder and set off for the center of town. If Iris was in the valley, as I suspected, I hoped to find some hint of her whereabouts there. The utter silence and stillness of the past town were deeply unsettling without her chatting away beside me. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Any second now, there would be a scream. 1,000 unmoving figures watched me as I walked, empty eyes staring from every window, from around every corner. I could feel the physical weight of their gaze on me. I could almost hear their running feet, see their reaching hands in the corners of my eyes. It had never been safe here. They'd just been waiting for me to be alone all this time. I pushed these paranoid thoughts out of my mind and kept moving. I had to find her. It wasn't hard. Once I reached town, I just followed the broken windows, hundreds of them, and I followed the blood. I walked faster and faster. I started to run. "Happy Valentine's Day," screamed every store that I passed. Pink balloons twisted noisily in the stale breeze. The blind black eyes of teddy bears watched me rush by, shoes crunching on shards of shattered glass. I found her on the floor of a record store. The windows were all broken, and the albums had been swept from the shelves and strewn about the floor. All of the covers were blurred smears. Whatever force had created this place couldn't reproduce fine print or detailed images. I didn't know why. It didn't matter. There was blood everywhere. "Iris," I said quietly, crouching beside her, touching her cheek. Her eyes slowly fell open, first one and then the other. She looked like a broken doll. "Oh," she said, smiling, blinking, as if she'd just woken up from a pleasant Sunday afternoon nap. "Hey, beautiful boy. You're bleeding." Her forearms were covered in fresh cuts. I'd seen the dense ladder of scar tissue on her arms and thighs many times before, of course. There wasn't anywhere on her body that I wasn't familiar with. But I'd never seen fresh ones. I'd hoped that she wouldn't need to do that anymore now that she had me. Thinking back, I suppose I only knew her for a few months. "Yeah," she said sheepishly. "I was hoping you wouldn't find me like this." "Come on," I urged. I didn't care what she'd done. I just wanted to make sure she was okay. "We need to get back to the house, call an ambulance." "No." She shook her head slowly. She seemed dazed, still half asleep. "I'm actually going to stay. I can't go home anymore." She tried to smile, failed miserably. The black pinpricks of her eyes had lost their sharp edge. "I'm going to stay here forever." "We can't stay, sweetie." I was fighting to keep the rising panic out of my voice. There was blood everywhere. Where was it all coming from? What had she done to herself? "We don't have anything over here. There's no medical supplies or food or, social media. We need to get back, don't we?" I didn't know what I was saying anymore. "Nah," she said simply. "I love you, Joe, but fuck off." She closed her eyes again and immediately dozed off. I called her name, shook her shoulders, even slapped her cheek, but she didn't stir. I crouched down, slid my arms under her shoulders and knees, and picked her up. Carrying a girl is a lot harder than movies and TV make it look. Maybe it's because the guys carrying girls out of burning buildings in those movies are jacked, and I'm just a skinny teenager. But within seconds, my arms were burning with the strain. It took a long time to get back to Somerville Street. I had to stop frequently, put her down, rest my arms. I tried to wake her every time. I couldn't. Her face was very pale. There was so much blood. Her blue hair was fading again, brown roots coming through. She'd need to dye it again soon. There was so much blood. I don't know how I hauled her up the ladder onto the house's gable. It's all a blur when I think back on it. They say mothers get the strength to lift cars if their baby is trapped underneath. It was probably something like that. As I dragged her towards the diamond-shaped window, she started to shake. I let out a breath I'd been holding in for as long as I could remember. She was moving again. She was waking up. We were going to go through the window, and I'd lay her on the bed where she'd taken my virginity. And I'd call an ambulance, and it would arrive quickly because we were in a quiet part of town and everything would be okay. Everything would be okay. Everything would be just like it was before. And we'd start making plans to move to another town, far away from my mom and her dad, and we'd get jobs in fast food or something, make enough money to live on, and she'd dye her hair again. And we'd have good days and bad days. We'd have years and years of days like that, and everything would be okay because we'd be together. The closer we got to the window, the more her body trembled. I could barely hold on to her. I dragged her another step, then another. We were so close now. We were almost there. Her body vibrated violently. "Hold on," I started to say, and then she vanished right out of my arms. Her empty, blood-spattered clothes fell onto the tiles like a pile of laundry. If I'm being honest with myself here and now as I write this all down, I had noticed she was dead several minutes earlier, as we'd been turning the corner onto Somerville. I just hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge it at the time. All I'd been thinking about was getting back to the present, to the real world, to a hospital where I'd spent a sleepless night in a waiting room until they told me that she was going to be okay, and that the cuts to her wrists I'd been refusing to look at hadn't been as deep as they looked. With calm and precise movements, I climbed back through the diamond window and into the pitch-black present, like it was a dance I'd rehearsed. I waited for my phone to reconnect to the network and dialed 911. When the operator picked up, I hung up without saying anything. I turned back to the window and started to climb through. I needed to go and look for her. The sapphire necklace had respawned back at the shop after it had disappeared. Maybe Iris had too. Maybe she was at her house or at the little park. Unbroken, just like all the windows. She'd be carving our initials into a tree, pulling items out of a picnic basket, smiling at me with that little gap in her front teeth, picking out some outlandish place for us to make love. Maybe lying on the grass next to the mausoleum, like in the song. She really liked that kind of thing. I couldn't wait to see her again. On the other side of the pitch-black window, it was a pitch-black night. I panicked, lost my balance, and fell headfirst into the front garden. That's where the police found me. They took me to the hospital, where I was treated for a broken shoulder. They had a lot of questions. They wanted to know where Iris was. I don't remember what I told them at the time. I was in a lot of pain, and my shoulder hurt too. I saw her dad for the first and last time. He was standing outside my hospital room while the police spoke to me. He looked terrified. He left town a few days later. I don't know where he went. "I love you, Joe," she'd said, "but fuck off." I don't know if she intended those to be her last words, but they fit her well. If I imagine a gravestone for her, I imagine those words carved into it. I imagine visiting it often, leaving flowers before it, watching those final words grow faint as the years go by. But of course there is no grave. Officially, she's considered a runaway. A ridiculous idea, I know. They found me literally covered in her blood. At first it was obvious they thought I'd killed her. I told them that she'd killed herself, that I'd found her body, that she should be in the house on Somerville Street. They didn't find her, of course. They didn't find anything. And when I went back there myself, as soon as I was able to, the diamond-shaped window was no longer a portal into the past. It was just an oddly shaped window. They're finally tearing the house down now after all this. That's what I heard anyway. The cops didn't have enough evidence to charge me with her murder, and there was no body anyway. Based on her dad skipping town days later and her own violent history, they assumed there had been a domestic dispute that had led to her hurting herself and then running away. They put out a half-hearted missing persons report, and that was that. "I'm so sorry, honey," my mom said when I got home from the hospital, holding me tightly. Her voice was choked with emotion, but I could see the corners of her mouth turned up in a slight smile. When I went back to school a few days later, a missing persons poster had been taped to my desk. A blurry photo of my dead girlfriend, taken before she'd started dyeing her hair, stared out of it. The other students seemed disappointed in my lack of reaction to it. She'd have hated that photo. And that's it. It's been a week and I don't really know what to do with myself. Mostly I hate myself. I spend a lot of time doing that. Entire days and nights, especially the nights. Sleep cannot reach me through the thick fog of guilt that has enveloped my mind. I should have paid more attention to the things Iris was saying to me. I should have understood her pain, engaged with it. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. There's no way of knowing now, but I wish I had tried. I said I loved her. But what I loved were the good times we were having together. Whoever is still reading this, please pay attention to the people you claim to love. Listen to what they are telling you. Really listen. Don't push it back. Because tonight is pizza and movies and sex and smiles, and tomorrow would be a much better time to broach such a difficult subject. There might never be a tomorrow. And if, somehow, you find a window that goes into the past, a past with nobody in it, leave it alone. It was left behind for a good reason. The past is an empty shell. It is not a place to linger. It is not a place to escape to. And the past is not your playground. "20 years ago, when I was 5, we moved to the town of Banana. Yeah, really Banana. I won't go into too much detail, but it was a small, dying town where the population maxed out at roughly 1,000, if that, and where the only chain that existed was a Dollar General. Every other building in town was either little mom and pop businesses or houses that slowly disappeared behind curtains of forest the deeper you went. For the entirety of my life there, it was a boring and at times miserable experience. We moved to Banana to be closer to my maternal grandmother, since she had health issues, and my mom wanted to make sure to help care for her as needed. Our house was nestled in the woods just outside of town. Woods so dense that if you walked a few steps past our driveway, you'd have a hard time seeing our house through the thickets. The house itself was moderately sized, big enough for me to have my own room and for us to have a spare to use as a guest room. My bedroom and the guest room were connected by a small bathroom, something that will be important later. The first few days there were exciting to my young, over-imaginative brain. I'd spend hours combing our house and yard searching for what hidden treasures this new land would hold for me. But I'd be disappointed by just how little there was to see beyond the rare sighting of a wild animal or discoveries of forgotten balls and trinkets. Once I started elementary, I also found that there was barely anything to do outside of school. I had friends for sure, but playdates weren't something that could happen every day, and neighboring houses were separated by dense forest and hidden away, making it hard for me to meet any of the neighbors' kids to hang out with. I guess my parents felt bad for the sudden change of lifestyle we once had living in the city, and decided the best solution to help cure my growing loneliness was to get a dog. I came home one day to be surprised by the excited kisses of a puppy when I opened our front door. He was about 10 weeks old, and a mix of blue-tick coonhound and Labrador retriever, which left his coat looking like an odd Jackson Pollock of browns, blacks, and whites. His name was Champ, and he instantly became my best friend. Like my shadow, he would follow me everywhere, and we'd spend hours playing in the yard. I convinced my parents to let him sit at the table with us while we ate, making sure he had his own chair at the table, and at night he'd always sleep in my room curled up next to me like a living pillow. He even saved me once from a cottonmouth that had found itself in our yard. He caught it in his teeth and thrashed it around until it turned limp after he saw it slithering towards me. I loved that dog so damn much. And when he went missing, it was one of the most devastating moments of my childhood. I was 7 at the time. I had been at school that day, and after the bus dropped me off, was looking forward to another afternoon playing with my dog. Instead of the usual excited licking or barking from Champ greeting me at our door, I found my mom and dad waiting for me seated in our living room. Instantly, I knew something had happened to him, and for the rest of the week, my eyes were bruised and swollen from crying. We put posters up everywhere we could think, on telephone poles, Facebook, in gas stations, and some mom and pop places even put them up inside their stores. We were hoping someone had seen Champ somewhere, and I prayed my heart out every night that I'd wake up to his wet nose against my cheek, whining for me to get up like he always did. But time went on, and there was no sign of him to be seen. Eventually, I moved past it. My parents offered to get us a new dog, but I didn't want one. It felt wrong and disrespectful to him, and I knew I wouldn't love another dog as much as I did him. And for 4 years, we lived without him, me, 11 at the time, spending most of my free time either alone playing in our yard or spent with friends whenever I could see them. And then, one night, he came back. We had just finished dinner. my mom washing dishes in the sink while my dad was storing leftovers, and I was busy playing on my Game Boy Advanced in our living room. I heard my mom gasp and a glass break, my dad immediately asking her what happened when I heard her say, "Is that—" "Oh my God, look." My dad went quiet and then immediately called out to me to come quick. I threw my Game Boy aside, worried for what exactly was going on when I saw out the kitchen window what my parents were looking at. Out in our front yard, partly illuminated by the glow of our windows in the night, was Champ. He stood on the cobblestone walkway 8 or so feet from the front door, staring at it. Immediately I ran to the door, my parents close behind, threw it open and ran to Champ. My dad caught me by my shoulder before I could make it, however. "Hang on, buddy, let me check to make sure he isn't hurt." I could see he was almost as excited as I was, but he also looked cautious. I understand now, obviously, Champ could have been hurt, rabid, or just scared, and my dad didn't want me to accidentally get hurt too. But I was so anxious to wrap my arms around my dog. I watched as my dad cautiously approached Champ, holding his hand out. "Hey boy, you remember me?" my dad asked as he lowered himself to Champ's level. He had gotten bigger since he was gone. Not a lot, but enough that he stood at about waist level with my dad, who was 6 feet 4 inches where he had once stood at his thigh. Champ turned his head to look at my dad, his eyes reflecting the light from our doorway in a way that made them gently glow, and lowered his head for a pat. My dad put his hand on Champ's head, and once he realized that Champ wasn't hurt, let me at him. My parents watched in joy as I held and sobbed into Champ's fur. My mom kept crying and saying things like how much of a miracle it was, while my dad wondered where Champ had been for so long. They were both astonished he found his way back, whereas I didn't care at all and just accepted the reality that he was here with me again. And at the time, it really seemed like he was just as happy to be back. He was literally shaking in my arms. That night, we gave Champ a bath and spent the evening in the living room, all of us together, finally whole again. I remember being so happy, it didn't bother me that Champ didn't show any of his usual excited and childlike traits. He spent the majority of the time just sitting and watching us, which I figured was him just taking in his home again. And just like when I was hugging him, each time I ran my hands through his fur or rubbed his head, his body shook. I worried he was cold, but my dad and mom told me he likely was just readjusting to his environment and didn't know how to show his excitement. When I went to bed a few hours later, now with him back at my side, it was like my heart was whole again. But unlike what my mom and dad assumed, he didn't go back to his old self. He regained some of his old traits, like following me around constantly and sitting at the table when we ate. But he wouldn't wag his tail as much as he used to, or even bark, really. He would lick every now and then, but they were slower and dragged on the skin, not the quick, excited kisses he used to give. He'd constantly watch us, his eyes shifting to whoever was talking at the time, like he was following the conversation. And he still shook when you touched him, or when he would lay next to me at night. I wrote the shaking off as excitement of some kind, and I still think it was, but not in a good way. There was also the whining. He didn't do it much, rarely at all at first, but when we were alone in the yard or laying in my bed at night, I'd be able to notice a low whine. Slowly he would get a bit louder with his whining, and there'd be nights he'd do it right next to my ear. I remember once turning and looking at him when he did it, and I was honestly scared for a moment because he was staring right at me while he whined. But I rubbed his head and told him to go back to sleep, though that usually didn't work. One night I finally got enough of it. It had been several nights of rough sleep due to his whining at this point, and I guess it stacked up. This quiet version of him that seemed more curious than playful made my heart ache for what had been. And when he started doing that noise in my ear again, I finally had enough and got out of bed. He did too, standing up and following me like he used to. But when I got to the door to gesture him to leave, he just stood there looking at me. "Go on, boy, out the door," I told him. He stood there still, slightly shaking. I felt a twinge of guilt denying him from sleeping with me, but I persisted. "Hey, come on, boy," I said out. "Now we can play tomorrow." Finally, Champ cautiously walked out, staring at me the whole time. I closed the door, locking it instinctually. As I was getting back into bed, however, I started hearing claws on my door. Champ was scratching desperately and making a low whining noise. I tried to ignore it, but at one point I had enough. "Go away, I'm not letting you in." When I said that, he stopped clawing at the door. I thought he had obeyed until I heard fur brush against the door and noticed the whine get a bit louder. Except this time, I swear the whine sounded more like a whisper. "Hey! Hey!" I felt my blood run cold. I didn't move from my bed, my mind muddy with confusion. You, in letting. Boy, come outside, play. The word sounded slightly high-pitched but warped, like he was trying to speak but they were catching on his tongue and his throat. Boy. Boy. I don't know when he stopped. I think I passed out before he finished. But I remember waking up to my mom knocking on my door and asking me why I locked Champ out. I told her Champ is making weird noises at night and keeping me up, and that I don't want him staying in my room anymore. She looked slightly hurt, not at me, but I think more because she remembered when I had loved Champ so deeply and was sad that I was moving on from him. But I think in some ways she also understood, since I think I hadn't been the only one getting a bit irritated with the new Champ. There were plenty of times my mom shooed him away after she got tired of him watching her while she cleaned the dishes, or had scolded him when he had opened pantry doors or drawers in the kitchen. Dad was pissed when he saw the scratch marks Champ had left on my door. He had stripped paint away from how long he had scratched. My dad wrote it off that he was probably anxious about not being near me since he had been gone so long, but at this point I wasn't so sure. I tried to explain to them that he had spoken and even show them, but he never did it around them, so of course they didn't believe me. I had started to fear Champ a bit. A bit of time passed after that night, and slowly I stopped acknowledging him when I would come home from school. His licks made my skin crawl, and even when he'd lay next to me I could feel his eyes on me. I started to sew in most of my time in my room, and he'd sit and wait at my door. I also started locking him out of my room every night, and he would still whine but never really speak. There were times he would wait in my room to try to sleep with me, but I would instead sleep in the guest room if that happened, and when I did, he'd just scratch on the guest door instead. Every now and then would I hear him whisper, and he'd say things like, "Hey boy, Mr. Want you, come outside, Mr. Want you, go outside." Or, "Hey boy, come here, Mr. Want you, look outside, play, we play outside." I told my parents less than a month after he first whispered words to me, and just about 4 months after he had been back, that I don't know if I can handle Champ anymore. I asked them if we could take him somewhere else. And normally I think most parents wouldn't be so willing to agree, but my parents had also grown annoyed of Champ's habits in their own ways. It was decided that the next day my dad would take him to the nearest shelter. I remember when I came out of their room after the conversation, Champ had been standing right outside the door. That night I tried to hang out with Champ a bit. I did feel horrible that we were going to get rid of him, but I think it was more because I'd come to realize my dog was never going to come back. He had been lost since he first disappeared 2 years ago. I walked in my room, closed the door on Champ as he started moving to try to come in, and got ready for bed. By this point, I would always make sure I locked my door since he sometimes would accidentally or perhaps purposely jiggle the handle while he clawed, and I didn't want to risk him coming in. I waited for the usual clawing to start, but it never did. And as I sat waiting for the worst, I eventually went to sleep. Click. Click. I don't know what time it was, but I know it was past midnight when I heard claws at the door handle. I scoffed, turning over to ignore them, when I realized the clawing wasn't coming at my bedroom door. Click, click. I'd always locked the bedroom door since that's where he usually clawed, but my skin turned cold when I realized he was clawing from behind the bathroom door. I'd never had to worry about it since he'd have to get through the guest room door and its bathroom door to get to mine, but that wasn't possible. Creak. I saw the briefest glimpse of Champ in the moonlight when he opened my bathroom door. He was walking on his hind legs, and I could tell he was wobbling a bit from the unsteady steps of his unbalanced body, and I could also see he was shaking so much. I closed my eyes and covered my head with my covers before he fully entered my room, praying he didn't see me awake. Tap. 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 His footsteps clattered against the wood floor. They were getting closer to my bed. Tap. 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 And it was now that I could hear, the first time since he had come back, that he was panting. There were no more footsteps. It felt like hours of silence when it had likely been no more than 30 seconds when I heard a voice. Hey boy, you, I see. My body was struck with rictus from terror. I didn't dare move. Hey. Come outside, first see boy, you sleep? Hey. I felt a shivering paw touch my head through the blanket covering me. Hey, look, hear me. I want show you outside forest wake upper look me. His last sentence sounded like it was spoken through chattering teeth. Even from under the covers I could hear how violently he was shaking. Tears streamed down my face. I know I was whimpering from fear. He pawed a bit at my covers, trying to get them off my head, but I kept holding them so tightly. No. You, awake. I didn't answer. Things got quiet after that and stayed so for the longest time. I started to think he had left until I heard nails click on the floor. Sunday, rises. Lucky, boy. After that, I heard it walk away from my bed, its nails tapping away through my bathroom, through the guest room, and into the hall. After that, I heard the sound of the front door unlock, after a few minutes of scratching, and the door swing open. I stayed in bed, shivering until the sun rose, and my mom and dad came into my room, alarmed that the front door had been left open last night somehow, and asking me if I did it. However, I think the look on my face and the faint claw marks on the bathroom door leading to my room made them think otherwise. It took a long time for me to settle down from that night. For the rest of my time in that house, I'd make sure every door and window was locked tight. We didn't stay at the house much longer. We were out by the end of the month. I think my parents knew that Champ had opened the door and left, but I don't think they understood how or wanted to. But it didn't matter. I was happy that we were leaving. Whatever that thing was, it definitely wasn't a dog. Even at my age, I knew that much, and I couldn't stand thinking that it was still out there watching us all the way until the day we loaded the last box and left. Even now, I wonder if the thing that acted like my dog Champ is still out there, and if it's still waiting for the chance to take me out to the woods. I spent my childhood in San Francisco. Although I moved away to Sacramento, I still visit San Francisco to see my parents at least once every 2 weeks. So to say that going to San Francisco for old time's sake doesn't quite apply to me. But this month I visited for that very reason twice, but not for happy reasons. Mr. Langdon was one of the most respected teachers at Sir Easton Elementary School, where I had studied. He was also my homeroom teacher. The tragic news that came from my parents was that Langdon had died by heart attack at the age of 70, 15 years after I left Sir Easton. The worst part of this was that he died in front of his class, surrounded by students desperately trying to save him. Their efforts, however, were futile, as they were just 9 years old. His sudden death sent shockwaves throughout the city. My mother handed me an invitation to his funeral, which was to be held at the church near our old school. Mr. Langdon often shared how symbolic the church was to him. His parents were married there, he was baptized there, and later he was married there as well. And now it was going to be his last destination before heading 6 feet under. What a place. Mr. Langdon's funeral was attended by nearly 10% of the city. As Sir Easton was the only elementary school in the area, many adults in the city, who had once been his pupils, came to bid their final farewell to the coolest and most respectable teacher they had ever known. A humble, kind-hearted spirit now embarking on his journey into eternity, surrounded by his students. The seating plan for the funeral was divided into 3 sections. One side was designated for current students who came to pay their respects to their mentor. It was quite surprising for many civilians to see so many students lining up and filling the seats. There wasn't any indication that they were attending the funeral simply because their teacher had listed it as an extracurricular activity. Instead, the kids seemed as though they had come of their own accord, genuinely wanting to honor a teacher they deeply respected. The second section, with the same number of chairs as the first, was reserved for Sir Easton's former students, mostly the parents of the current students. These parents had once attended the school themselves and sat in the very same classrooms as their children do now. The final section was meant for people like me, those who had been in Sir Easton's class in any year. We were the students who had spent the most time learning under Mr. Langdon. I remember when we were young and rebellious, Mr. Langdon would often use small treats as incentives to keep us in line, especially during school assemblies when we couldn't stop whispering to each other. This time there was no treat and we were all behaving. I recognized some faces here, and I remember how they acted when I was in class with them. Not even the class clown or the naughty kids were snickering. Everyone in this room looked as if they were witnessing the end of the world. Soon I realized that I was sitting next to Jeff, someone I had been hoping to see this morning. But at the same time, he was the last person I expected to see in person. The thing is, many of the students from my class actually kept in touch with each other from time to time, even after we graduated. But that wasn't the case for Jeff. The last time I saw him was online. through a social media post telling me he was no longer in America but living in Wales. I don't know if he came for the funeral or if he moved back to America. I wonder when he came to America. He didn't look tired at all, and he seemed like he was expecting this day. I just wonder why. The funeral began and lasted an hour. Mr. Langdon's coffin was moved to a cemetery near the church, the same one where Mr. Langdon's father, grandfather, and grandmother were buried. However, they were not buried together or alongside one another. As we watched the coffin go down, I was surprised to see who was filling the hole. It was Jeff. Surely he didn't come back just to bury his old teacher. The other person who was helping him fill the hole was a civilian. I could sense there was something wrong about Jeff. He had just appeared in America after years of silence, only to fill his teacher's grave, and that wasn't even the weirdest part. The weirdest part. While the other gravedigger silently worked without any sign of emotion, Jeff was showing signs of dread. But it wasn't triggered by sadness or grief. I saw it, and it was triggered by fear. The moment I could finally talk casually with Jeff was when lunch came. To celebrate the life of our old mentor, we visited his favorite pizza place, ordered various pizzas, and toasted to a better tomorrow without a mentor to guide us. I talked to a lot of friends as we ate, learning a lot about life. Once everyone left, it was just me and Jeff. That's when Jeff started to talk to me casually, a red flag if I say so myself. Jeff told me about his life, and I talked about mine. We were both salesmen from different nations working for the same branch, which felt like a twist of fate. But one thing I was sure of was that he was avoiding talking about Mr. Langdon, and I caught on as soon as he dodged the topic multiple times. "Does Mr. Langdon's death upset you?" Then there was a big sigh, one that caught me by surprise. Is it just me, or is there something wrong with Mr. Langdon's photo in our class section of the school yearbook? School yearbooks. Huh? It was something I hadn't thought about in a while, but I do know for a fact that I own the Sir Easton School yearbook for nostalgia's sake. "What about it?" I asked. "Do you know why I came back to America?" "To ask you this question. Are you familiar with his eye color?" I nodded. And that was when Jeff brought out the school yearbook to show me the class photo. At first I thought there was nothing wrong with it, until I saw Mr. Langdon's photo. There were no eyes. It looked like a very well-done cosplay of that famous Minecraft creepypasta character, Herobrine. His eyes were completely missing, like something straight out of a zombie movie, and it felt like I was being watched. "Was it always like this?" I asked. "I'm not sure," Jeff replied. We both stared at the photo, trying to figure out what was wrong with it, and then Jeff chuckled. "Bah, maybe I'm just overthinking things. A very badly edited photo, probably," he said. That was when I came to my senses and realized that was the only logical answer to whatever the hell this photo had become. At least half of it. Why hadn't people reported this messed up photo in the yearbook? Were his eyes always like this and we just hadn't noticed? Our thoughts eventually made us stop eating, and the restaurant worker, who probably saw us as homeless men looking for shelter to read crime books, kicked us out. I left, half confused, half furious. I checked on Jeff, who was still staring at the photograph. There was no doubt something was wrong with Mr. Langdon's photo. Then I remembered what my mom had said when I first got the yearbook. I was lucky I hadn't demanded one right away because a lot of the photos, especially those of staff members, weren't taken well and were of bad quality. "Maybe you got the early issue, the one with the faulty photos," I suggested. Jeff agreed. He admitted he might have been a greedy bastard trying to get the earliest issue of the school yearbook, not caring that it might still need double check. We kept talking about school because of the yearbook as we walked to our cars. Before I left, I got his phone number so I could contact him to meet up on another day, and Jeff waved goodbye as I rode home. It was a strange day. It started to rain when I drove back to Sacramento. On the way, I was listening to rock music and driving casually until the moment the music stopped. That was when the thought returned, am I overthinking things, or am I simplifying things? The thoughts started to disturb my focus on the road, almost making me run a red light at a crossroad. That was when I stopped thinking about it and decided to focus on the road home. I parked my car in front of the house and headed inside. It was a clean house filled with emptiness. Since I lived a minimal lifestyle, having furniture left and right was something I was not fond of at all. The only furniture I had was a chair, table, couch, and bed. Despite spending most of my time outside of my work here, the emptiness of my house felt surreal for some reason right now. as if I had returned home after a decade of being away. I started looking for the yearbook Jeff mentioned. I had taken a lot of school stuff while moving homes, and eventually I stumbled upon the yearbook. I flipped through the yearbook and saw the photos of my classmates. As I skimmed through, I came across Mr. Langdon's photo. Just as Jeff had said, what was supposed to be a normal photo of Mr. Langdon didn't seem normal at all. I don't know what was wrong with the photo, but he looked like a zombie, a decaying corpse. Even worse than how I saw him before, he looked like a dead body from at least a century ago. I then looked at the other photos and nearly dropped the yearbook. Jeff. His photo showed the same problem. What shocked me the most was the fact that when I was talking to Jeff, there was nothing wrong with his photo and his copy of the yearbook. Only Mr. Langdon's photo had the weird zombie-like face, but my yearbook was telling a different story. I rubbed my eyes, hoping I was seeing things, but there was no doubt. Immediately, I contacted Jeff to tell him about what I found in the yearbook, that his face was decaying in it. But for some reason, I got no response, only the sound of the phone ringing. I got a message as soon as I hung up. I thought it was from Jeff, but the message was a DM invitation to a chat room, and the members were all my classmates whom I had met during the funeral. I had forgotten about the thing I saw in the yearbook and grinned as the chat room of my old friends greeted me. They were all talking about how they were living in the current world after graduation and the class's separation, reminiscing about how they missed each other and lamenting the loss of Mr. Langdon. I looked at the member list to see that Jeff hadn't joined yet, but the chat messages distracted me immediately. They were planning a reunion, a proper reunion the next day, with many of our classmates agreeing to it. The place, school, our old class. While it was obvious due to recent events, the place was going to be pretty somber. But hey, at least this might be a sign of a new beginning. I headed to bed early that night and had a very strange dream. I was in a classroom filled with all my friends, where I was looking down and writing notes. When I looked up, I saw Mr. Langdon's face. Instead of the face of a normal man, his face was decayed like a zombie's. I looked beside me to see Jeff, who was staring at me, and I froze when I saw his face, decayed like Mr. Langdon's in the photo. It filled me with unspeakable fear. What terrified me even more was the way Jeff stared at me. It didn't look like he was staring at me at all. It looked as if he was staring into something else, accepting the fact that he was like this, the fact that he was a corpse. I was woken up by the sound of what I thought was my alarm clock. Instead, it was a myriad of messages cramming through my phone. DMs from the people in the chat room, filled with RIPS, NOS, and crying face emojis. I entered the chat room and furiously scrolled up to see one of the students say this: Jeff died in a car crash. My body shook with unspeakable fear. 24 hours hadn't even passed, and here I was, hearing the news that Jeff was dead. As I called one of my friends and hurried downstairs, something unspeakable appeared near me. The yearbook was open, as if it were luring me there, as if it were waiting for me to check. I looked at the yearbook and immediately dropped my phone as if the book were telling me something. Jeff's face in the yearbook had met the same fate as Mr. Langdon's photo, decayed like a dead body, mummified, dried up. This was something I didn't expect. I just stood there numb for at least a minute. The moment I started to move was when I saw the clock reach 8. Checking my DM, I saw a message from early this morning saying that Jeff's family was going to bury him as soon as possible, meaning the funeral was today. I had just come back from one yesterday, and now I was attending another. Not even 24 hours had passed. But that's not what I was focused on. I wasn't thinking about my schedule. I just couldn't stop thinking about what the hell was going on with the damn yearbook. Jeff's memorial was held at a different church this time, with fewer people attending. Unlike Mr. Langdon, Jeff was not a well-respected civilian. A normal civilian, I mean. And unlike Mr. Langdon's coffin, which was open for us to bid farewell and see his tranquil face as he passed on. According to his parents, Jeff's body had been brutally broken into pieces. What was inside the coffin were just parts of him. The funeral lasted the same length, but people did not move from the seat despite the coffin leaving and Jeff's family following to their son's grave. A lot of us just sat there in silence, probably thinking the same thing. We had to attend a funeral twice in a row, and just as my mindset was turning for a better future, "Are you guys out of your goddamn minds?" I turned along with others as a commotion started behind me. There was 3 men, one-sided with the second, trying to break up the fight, the third man grabbing one of the man's shirts, I didn't recognize the man who was being grabbed onto, but the one who was breaking the fight was Fred, a school bully, and the person who was grabbing the man by the shoulder was Harold. I knew for a fact it was Harold because ever since he became a successful businessman, he was all over the news in the state. "Tax Jeff's family, right now. You have no dignity," Harold attacked. "It is business. Jeff had borrowed money from us," Fred barked. "If that prick is going to not pay that debt and head to the grave, then you need to know that we need a replacement." "By getting their damn family to pay back," Fred's companion shouted. The classmates all rounded up like they did when they were bullying Harold in the past. I was hoping some of them were humane enough to know that Fred was wrong in this fight. Asking for money in front of a grieving family for their personal gain was not a good timing. But I saw the repeat of the things that happened decades ago. People sided with Fred, and soon it was not 1 versus 2, but 1 versus all besides me, who stood there numb, watching Harold argue with others as shouts and swears were thrown to each other, telling each other to go to hell and die a horrible death. Not even 24 hours has passed and the class reunion went to shambles. It was no-brainer that after this day there won't be a new day to choose for reunion. Everyone had their reason to hate the other faction now. Or at least the reunion will continue without the presence of Harold. As if Harold knew that was going to happen. He looked furious. I silently left the building as other students continued their strife. I couldn't believe it. I was furious as well. Not only did they have the guts to continue bullying someone after a decade, but they had the nerve to mock someone in front of a funeral. I just felt like I was going to explode if I kept driving to the house. Instead of heading back, I phoned my mom and asked if I could stay overnight at their house. With her permission, I decided to head to my parents' house and spend the day there instead of driving back home. Not only had it been 2 weeks since I last saw them, but I just felt like I shouldn't drive for my sanity. As I mentioned, I visit my family's house every 2 weeks, but this was the first time I was going to spend the night there, instead of returning home the same day. Because Mom knew about the funeral of Jeff, she hugged me as I entered. I assured her I was okay and headed to what used to be my bedroom. Ever since I left home, Mom and Dad had been using the room to store their belongings and old house furniture, albums, and books, especially books. My dad was a book collector. He collected books from around the world and stored them to read when he had time after work. I looked around the bookshelf. Classics such as Gulliver's Travels and Treasure Island on the top shelf. Horror novels such as It and Misery on the middle, and family albums on the bottom shelf. As I dug through the family album shelf, I saw something that made my blood freeze. That yearbook. But I knew it was my parents' copy. I was pretty sure my parents bought another copy from somewhere else after I took the original. It was also one of the last editions of the yearbook from that year, meaning this was brand new. But instead of wonder, fear filled my mind. Carefully, I took it out and flipped through the pages. As the pages turned, I saw the photos of other classes, and they all looked fine. Then what I saw in the photo almost made me throw up. Not only was Jeff's photo mummified like Mr. Langdon's photo, but I was surrounded by the photos of those decayed people. Half of the portraits of the students were turning into people with rotten flesh. The worst of the photos was the photo of Harold. His photo was not just mummified, it was on fire as if it was some kind of undead from the deepest parts of hellfire. I instinctively shut the yearbook when my mom asked if I wanted pizza for lunch. I calmly tried to say yes. It was definitely a yes with a slight tone of fear, but she didn't notice, and I had no intention of showing it to her. I couldn't believe what was happening with the yearbook. The black magic surrounding me was confusing. I was looking at a yearbook where people's faces slowly decayed. That was the first thing. The second was that anyone whose photo decays dies within the next 24 hours. The third was that after death, the photos of the deceased student turn into cursed mummies. I checked the group chat to see if there was any activity. A myriad of messages were being posted between each other on the phone. Philip. I am suggesting Italian for dinner. Jacob. Try to avoid the pizza place Harold's parents own, David. Maybe we should visit them to tell them how shit their son is, Jim, LOL. We shoo. As soon as that message was sent, I found myself staring at the yearbook. What I saw was this. The photos seemed to change in an instant, as if I were watching a PowerPoint presentation. The images of decaying students were now mummified, and the others, who hadn't been decaying corpses before, now were. Instinct kicked in, and I realized my colleagues had been in an accident. Without a word, I ran out of the house and began wandering the city, searching for answers about what had happened to my friends. As I sprinted toward the city square, ambulances began to appear from multiple parts of the city, and from a distance I saw it. A bus had flipped over and landed on its roof at the edge of the lake, while a black Toyota lay crushed like a pancake atop the bridge. A crowd of civilians had gathered to witness the carnage, and I subconsciously joined them. They surrounded the bus as paramedics rushed in and began pulling out the bodies. It was clear to anyone that such an accident left little hope for survival. The survivors crawled out of the bus and were escorted to the ambulances, while the emergency team searched through the wreckage for bodies. I looked over at the bridge and saw the car that had been crushed by the force of impact from the bus. Inside was a driver I knew, and I immediately understood why this had happened. The driver was Harold.